Do we have everybody that's 1, 2? Just gonna wait for Pat. Do we have Pat in here?
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year, Sam.
I'm here, Ken.
No, I see you. I got you now. I don't know why, Pat. You're on my screen for.
How about now?
Yep. And Jim, are you all set with your crew? 1, 2, 3, 4. You have a quorum. And then school committee, we have 1, 2, 3. You got a quorum. Good. Okay. So I'm going to call to order this meeting, joint meeting of the Select Board, School Committee, and Finance Committee, where it's 6:01 p.m. on January 11th. Meeting will be held through virtual Zoom. 2 quick notices. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Law, Chapter 38, Section 18, and subsequent orders imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, this meeting will be conducted via remote participation to the greatest extent possible. Members of the public who wish to watch the meeting may do so by accessing the Chelmsford telemedia website at www.chelmsfordtv.org. No in-person attendance or members of the public may be permitted, but every effort may be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event that we are unable to do so, despite best efforts, we will post on the town's website an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive recording of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting. We are on a Zoom call, so if everybody just keeps in mind, whatever you type in the chat screen is part of the public record. It doesn't matter if you do a private chat or an open chat, it becomes part of the public record and the public can see that. So just keep that in mind as we go through the meeting. So it's that. We will move on to Darlene, I think, are you up first?
Hello, everybody. Happy New Year. I just want to update everybody where we are. We're 6 months in to the fiscal year, which is kind of crazy to say that already, that we're 6 months in. Feels like my auditors just left and I just finished the other year. But we're through December, and so the numbers I'm going to be running through you. These are through the December 31st revenues and expenditures. Again, we're 6 months in, so we're 50% at our benchmark, so we should be pretty much 51% of our revenues received and 50% of the expenditures for departments. I'm not sure if, are we doing a PowerPoint? I'm not sure if the
John, do you want to share your screen, John, while Darlene speaks to it?
I mean, I can either just speak or I don't know how you want to do that.
Probably be easier for people to follow if we put the slides up there and then just ask John to change page. Probably the easiest thing. If Ken, have you given John sharing? Okay,
yeah,
sharing authority.
John's got co-host. He's
okay,
got
great.
it, but he's muted.
I'll just first start, while he's getting the slides up, we'll just first start with the revenues. For local receipts, our largest local receipt revenue, of course, is the motor vehicle excise tax. We've actually seen an increase. Again, people, we think people are still leasing vehicles. So when their leases are up, they're then releasing vehicles. And that's where we're just, for these last several years, we've just seen that number either stay pretty much the same as the year before. We haven't seen really a decline over the last 5 years. So for fiscal 21, we've actually seen an increase from the prior fiscal year, about $186,000 or 38% from prior year. We will be receiving the large motor vehicle commitment. We always get that in like January. So John Souza will be receiving that commitment. And that's usually our big one. And then we have smaller commitments throughout the rest of the year, but that's really where our big one. So we haven't seen that yet, but when we see that, we'll even know better from how we can compare to prior year. But nice to see an increase from the prior year, so that helps out for 21. The next one that we usually see that's one of our largest for revenues under the local receipts is the permitting.
Are we able to share the slides or no?
I'm not sure. John's muted.
John's muted.
Yourself?
Can you unmute him, Ken?
If I can, I do have my slides. If I
did
Yeah,
request you unmute. There he goes.
Yep, there we go.
Can you get them up? Can you get the slides up, John?
Yep.
Or
Yes, I thought the presentation was up. Sorry, we'll try it
That's
right now.
there we go. Yep.
Okay, let me just get this.
Right.
John, if you just hit that little button up top with the, it's the fifth one in, it should make this just a screen instead of a,
Just
that
maximize,
little,
maximize the screen, John. There you go.
It's at the bottom, right?
Yep, I'm just trying to put it into projector
There you go.
format just so that it will.
Hit slideshow. This is Pete. Hit slideshow up top, John, and then hit play. And there's a play from beginning. And then you can just scroll through it. Oh, it's not, it didn't play.
How is that visible?
it works.
It works.
Again, let's do the permitting. We see a small increase from prior year, only about 11%. It's about almost $85,000 from the previous year through December. The good news there, though, is we've actually collected $798,000, or 82% of the $950,000 that we budgeted for the current fiscal year. There are a few large projects. You'll see them as you're driving around town. You'll know exactly where they are. And we've also seen a lot of home improvement activity, and we think that's just due to COVID, people staying home, and people still working around their homes and getting home projects done. So we've just seen a little bit of an increase there, but what the good news is that we're actually we're going to most likely exceed the budgeted amount of $957,000. Hotel room tax is also exceeded from prior year, but this is the reasoning there is because we've actually, not because people are traveling or staying in our hotels, but we're actually sheltering for the homeless, and so we're actually getting payments from the Commonwealth to shelter those homeless in the hotels, and that's what's increasing that amount. And the meals tax, as I think everybody is not surprised to see, where it's actually declined from prior year. And of course, this is just due to the COVID-19 restaurant operation restrictions. We've seen a 30% decrease from prior year. But I don't think anything that's really a surprise. And one of the last things we've seen a great increase in is our SRAX receivables. Notably, we received a $241,000 sale of SRAX. So we had a sale, our second quarter sale of some credits generated from our solar production that we sell that actually helped with that line item. So that's a larger increase from the prior year. We also had we've had no snow. The summer was we had a good summer sun-wise. So we were generating a lot of solar production. And again, we're still generating that solar because the snow is not piling up on the solar panels. So we're continually doing well there. John, if you just go to, just bring it down to the next. And so you can just see, this is just my report, just showing you the current, sorry that says October, it really up top under where it says that should actually say December. Those numbers you can see we're actually in total we're 40% higher from the prior year. And we're, you know, 30, we're about 37% in budget versus actual for the current year. That number will increase when we get our January motor vehicle excise. That number will increase there. And this is just where our property tax and real estate collections, again, we're always, we're right on target there at 50%. John and his team do a great job with tax collection. And then we just have the state budgeted, again, we're at the 50% benchmark. If you go to the next page, John, we'll see the departments individually by the municipal administration, the school department, public safety and such. You'll see that those where everybody is within their 50%. Nobody's running high. I have no concerns on anybody's budget going forward at this point. We'll see how the next 6 months go, but everybody looks like they're doing fine. You'll see that those adjustments on the additional town meeting votes, those were, some of them were actually meeting votes that we had at town meeting, and then some of them are from the recap that I had just finished to do adjustments on. The next few slides, we can just go through them. These are, I just like to show everybody, I think it's good to see this maybe a couple times a year. I don't do it every month for everyone, but these are the revolving funds. So the first one is the school lunch. You'll see that that is actually, looks like it's in the negative. I've been talking with the director. It's just what's happening there is that because they're actually shut down, but they're actually still doing some feeding. We're running a little behind in that, but we have she has some money in her general fund. She also has money in her other Meals on Wheels revolving account that we'll be able to draw from. So, and she's been getting grants to cover these deficits, so we'll be fine there. Then just going down, you'll see there's the school circuit breaker. These are some of the school accounts, adult ed, child care. These are just revolving accounts, just like people to see balances. If anybody has any questions, I can post these. I can send them to anybody if anybody wants to see them and just be able to see them in detail. But these are pretty much the school accounts. This is summer school, your school choice account, the civic activities accounts. A lot of these are the school revolvings. And then we get into reserve for appropriation. These are all where the sewer betterment fundings are. And then the next ones are really the revolving accounts that are what they consider donation accounts. So these accounts are specific. The money is donated for specific reasons and are to be used for these specific reasons. So these are all a lot of our donation accounts, what they call gift and donations. And that's pretty much it. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take any questions. But so far, 6 months in, I see no concerns. I think we're doing well considering this pandemic. So I think we're going to be, I think we'll do well when we finish the fiscal year. I think we're going to be okay.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
It seems like there should be some additional expenses for the election. I'm not sure about the police budget. How do their expenditures go?
Mm-hmm. So on the let's talk first elections. So elections, actually, they got a grant. So I actually didn't show the grant accounts on here, but they actually got a postage grant, and they ended up getting a grant that they charged all of their election workers to. So there's no, they actually, if they had to charge everything to their general fund account, yes, they would have been in a deficit. But with getting those grants, that was able to help them. And then they also got the early opening grant, early voting grant that they actually charged to also. So that's on that. Police department, we don't, anything that the police and fire and concerned with like PPEs and all of that, we're actually, now that and we're continuing with the under the CARES Act, we're able to charge that to all of that grant and put in for reimbursement. So all of that in any COVID testing, all of that is being charged under the CARES Act. And now it just got extended out to December of 2021. So we're still able to charge those things, cleanings, if the town offices for extra cleaning, the library and such, all of those charges are going to be charged allowed under the CARES Act. So that's helping out in a lot of people's general fund, because anything that's COVID related can be charged to this CARES Act. Does that answer your question?
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Everybody's good? All right. John, we'll move on to you.
Good evening, everyone. The Capital Planning Committee met back in December, and as many of you know, the committee included representatives from all three boards that are meeting here this evening. The Select Board was represented by Virginia, the School Committee was represented by Jeff, and the Finance Committee was represented by Amina.
Excuse me, John, just one correction. I am not a member of the committee.
Right, you're a liaison from the Select Board. Yep, thank you. The committee received funding requests for 34 projects totaling just over $6.2 million. And after holding public hearings and reviewing all the projects in detail, 24 projects were approved for funding, and of those, 3 were reduced for the funding level, 9 were deferred, and 1 project was withdrawn. If we look at this first slide, this shows a breakout of the FY22 capital plan by functional area. And you can see that some of the major categories here are public works, just over 25% of the total plan, school buildings at over $1 million, that's about just under 27% of the total. And then school technology and security with that funding level just under 600,000, that represents about 15%. And I'll show a few of these projects in more detail in the slides ahead. That gives us a total for this year's recommended level for this year's capital plan of $3,893,974. There's one project I'll speak to later, and for this one, it actually involves the Westland School building, the kitchen. The school administration, the school committee agreed to provide $75,000 in funding from the Child Care Fund to fund a portion of that. So that gives us a net amount that will be funded through bonds of just over $3.8 million. On these next 2 slides, this shows a list of all the projects that are recommended for funding in FY22. And starting off with municipal IT, this is for $50,000. This is a continuation of a transition from mechanical locks for some of our town buildings over to a more electronic system that involves swipe cards. The senior center parking lot is scheduled to be repaved. That's just over $300,000. There are 3 projects for the town library. The first is a computer replacement. That's the second phase of their efforts to every roughly 4 to 5 years, they go through and have to replace the computers to upgrade them because the amount of use they get. There's a project that involves replacing carpeting in Adams Library. This is the 3rd and final phase. After this phase, the building will be completely recarpeted. The next project is the installation of an emergency generator, and this will allow the library to serve as an emergency heating or cooling station for residents. The next project involves the police department. That's $32,000, funds the purchase of 2 electronic traffic signs that can be moved at various locations in town. The next 3 projects on the list you see involve the fire department. It's a replacement of a service vehicle that does plowing at all the stations and other work. There's also the replacement of a staff vehicle. It's an older SUV type vehicle. And then the third project for the fire department is the replacement of the mechanic's hydraulic lift that's used in the garage facility at Richardson Road. The issue there is that's replacing a lift that's about 30 years old. The next few projects you see involve public works, sidewalk construction for $350,000, roadway improvements for $400,000, $170,000 funds a replacement of an older piece of sidewalk snow removal equipment that's used to remove snow from a lot of the sidewalks in town. The next is to replace an aging Parks Department vehicle. And then the last one on this page is an upgrade for the facilities shop. This is basically the metal building that you've seen, the steel building that's located behind the high school. And going on to the next page, continuing with some facilities projects. The next project replaces 3 older vehicles with hybrid vehicles. The vehicles that are going to be replaced are going to be recycled down to other departments, and that will help the senior center with a need that they have, as well as the library that has a need to replace a very old pickup truck. The next project involves the installation of roof safety ladders and skylight grates on a number of town buildings throughout the community. And also the next project involves an building insulation upgrade for the Chelmsford Center for the Arts, or the old town hall building, which will provide a lot of energy savings. And then the next series of projects all relate to our public schools. The next project is a door safety hardware upgrade that involves 3 school buildings. The one after that is a replacement of some damaged floor tiles throughout Harrington School, followed by the replacement of restroom partitions at Center Elementary School. This is the next project on the list is a complete kitchen remodel at the Westlands Community Ed Center. And the next project is a kitchen ventilation system upgrade for the South Row School. The next project is the replacement of an exterior lift or elevator that's used outside the Parker School for $127,000. And then finally, this is a surveillance and security system upgrade at 4 elementary schools in town. And you can see the total is just under 3.9 million. And as I mentioned, the school administration, the school committee was supportive of using 75,000 childcare funds to defray a portion of that Westlands project. And that leaves us a net amount to be borrowed of just over 3.8 million. This next slide just shows how this plan fits with and a history of prior plans. You can see that the FY22 plan is slightly more than last year, but roughly 87,000 more than last year's plan, but right in the same neighborhood. We also, just for historical purposes, show the percentages between general government projects and school, and the ones for our public schools. The percentages vary from year to year based on the mix of projects. For example, one year you could have a large piece of equipment such as a fire truck, and another year you could have a very large school project. So that affects the percentages. This next slide, I know many of you have seen before. This is just to show, many of our facilities in the community are aging. It's just to remind folks that may not have seen this before of the years that many of our buildings were constructed, and thus the reasons that we need to continually make capital investments in a lot of our facilities to keep them functioning for the needs of the town. That concludes my summary. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer questions on them.
Does anybody have any questions for John?
I'm sorry, I guess I do have a question. How is the $75,000 offset how was that amount arrived at? And what is the balance of the child care fund now?
Yeah, to answer Kathy's question, that was based on Dr. Lang had, our superintendent of schools had gone back and looked at the percentage of general population students at that facility versus some of the other programs such as childcare, and that percentage was calculated using that. So what the attempt was to try to apportion the amount of that project that could be charged back based on the childcare program, with the understanding that the remainder is used, the kitchen would be used by other programs that use that building.
And just to answer her question about the balance in that account, it's $900,000 is in that account right now.
Okay, thank you.
John, I don't see any questions in the chat box. So with that, if nobody has any questions, I will move on here and turn it over to Dr. Denise Pigeon.
Good evening, and thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here tonight to represent your public vocational technical high school. I always have to start with just a positive story about one of our students. Last year, I know that I had mentioned to you that we had 2 CTE presidential scholars that were nominated from Neshoba Tech that went on to the state, that also went forward to the national level. This is unheard of. 2 years in a row, Neshoba Tech has had a student that has been selected by Commissioner Riley to go forward to be recognized at the national level. And this is the 2nd year in a row that that student is from the town of Chelmsford. So a great congratulations to Nicholas Giannino. He was selected out of all of every vocational school puts 2 students forward, and the commissioner selects 5 to move forward, and he was selected on the list. He participates in our veterinary assisting program and has known that he's wanted to be a vet tech or veterinarian since he was 10 years old. So very pleased he's able to participate in that program for us. Next slide. I wanted to take a minute to also talk about the current model that we are functioning under, as it will have an impact on our FY21 budget status. So we opened in the hybrid model at the start of the school year, and we've continued in that model all along. So our students are attending full in person on their technical program week, and they are remote on their academic week. We have also prioritized some of our high needs students to be in person on both weeks for both their shop week and their academic week. And we have some students that are participating in a fully remote model. In order to make this happen, we really needed to look at our spaces and make a lot of configuration changes within the building to be able to get all of our students in person for their technical experience. So we have repurposed the cafeteria, the library, the Viking Forum, the gymnasium, all to accommodate spreading out so that our students could be in person full-time for their technical program instruction. And in terms of the FY21 budget update, or the current budget update, like everyone else, we have had some unanticipated costs that were related to reopening. For example, some of what I just described in terms of reconfiguring spaces. In addition, doing a full assessment of our HVAC system and making some HVAC upgrades. We've also had some other costs that were unexpected in terms of special education and making sure we were serving students in terms of any learning loss that may have happened in the past. We also, when the guidance came out regarding vocational technical schools, there was an additional round of guidance that came out right before reopening with guidelines in terms of tool sharing and equipment sharing and programs. So in some cases, we did have to increase the hand tools that were available to make sure that we weren't sharing too many items between too many students. I am pleased to share that our towns have been wonderful in terms of working collaboratively with us to be able to access CARES funding to assist in some of those unanticipated costs. I also want to share that our staff did come forward in the middle of closure and agreed to a 1-year contract extension at a 0% increase. We knew that we had a lot of unanticipated costs and that we were working with limited funds, and the staff did vote a 1-year 0% for the current year, as well as the administration followed suit on that. In terms of spending, we do anticipate we will have an excess and deficiency that will be under the 5%. And as we've always historically done, we would put whatever E&D we have at the end of the year to offset the assessments to the towns. I've also recently posted our most recent audit to our school website at neshobatech.net and our actuals to date. Next slide. When we're talking about the development of the FY22 budget, in terms of how that will have an impact on each of our towns in terms of their assessments, enrollment is always the driving factor. Even in a year when the budget is level funded, variations in enrollment can cause a town to have an increase or a decrease in their assessment, all based on the formula with enrollment. Chelmsford has experienced an increase this year from FY21 to FY22 of 10 additional district students. And of that, 2 of those students are postgrads, which is a decrease in the postgrad population from last year. And our overall, Chelmsford's increase, was 12 students. Our overall increase was 10 district students. If you look back over the last 10 years, we've had an increase in enrollment from students from Chelmsford every year over the past 10 years. Next slide. Some of our budget drivers, again, contractual increases, which is true for all of us. Again, I think the 0% that was taken by the staff this year will have a positive impact on the budget for next year. Due to that, we are finalizing negotiations for moving forward. We also have about a $10,000 increase to the Middlesex retirement system. That is just a fixed cost that we must budget. Rising costs for special education. We also have to fund an additional school nurse. We did at the beginning of the school year have to add an additional school nurse to take on the increased workload, and we do plan to fund that position moving forward. Our transportation fixed costs are around $60,000. Insurance, health insurance fixed costs, we're anticipating around a 5% increase there as well as other across the board increases in vendor contracts. And these are just some of the fixed costs that we have to manage in our budget requests. Other things to consider, I'm sure you'll hear more about this from Paul as the presentation moves forward, but state funding is very uncertain. If we do experience an increase in direct Chapter 78 of $30 per student, which we've seen in the past, not most recently, but that would only be an increase in state revenue funds of about $20,000. As you know, we've also been working incrementally over the past several years to slow down in terms of the amount of one-time funds that we're putting towards the budget. I would anticipate this year we would probably not continue with that adjustment plan as we move forward, but those for at least the next few years, those are discussions that are underway. We also have some significant capital needs that we have to fund, which I will speak to on a future slide. From our findings of our full facilities assessment, one of the biggest repair projects that we're facing moving forward is that we do have to, in phases, replace and repair our fire suppression system across the board in our building. And we also have to work towards our interior and exterior lighting system upgrades. We are pleased that our electrical students are going to be able to partner with us in this project and actually do the physical work. We will just have to buy the components to do that. So that will be a significant savings in our capital planning. And then we have our other annual needs as usual. We do anticipate some savings. Again, we continue to be very aggressive in terms of applying for any type of grant funding. We've been very successful with obtaining workforce skills capital grant funds, and we do have another application pending. Each time we get one of these grants, we are able to offset the spending in the budget for making sure that our equipment and our technical programs remains industry standard. We've also received some technology grants recently that has also helped in that respect. And again, with our technical programs, having them do as much on-site capital projects as possible, especially in the time of COVID, being able to do more projects in-house has been helpful with our capital planning. We also anticipate continued savings through our partnership with Greater Lawrence Tech and our energy agreement that we have in place. In terms of our stabilization account, continues to be healthy at our goal of 8 to 10% of our annual budget. I would not be recommending that we fund this in the next year or so. And in terms of OPEB, thank you to Paul Cohen for continuing to serve as a trustee on our OPEB board. We do, in our current plan to have an annual fund, an annual amount that we put towards our OPEB liability. In terms of next steps, where Neshoba is in the process, tomorrow night at our school committee meeting, we'll be voting a working session on the budget. And we will also be hosting a budget subcommittee meeting at the last week of February. We're looking to host a virtual presentation. It's unfortunate we can't do breakfast this year. I know that's always something that we enjoy doing for our partners, but it looks like we'll be doing a virtual presentation in February when our budget is more finalized. Budget will go to public hearing on February 9th. And again, our timeline is very short because we have to have our budget approved 45 days before our first town meeting. And our first town meeting is scheduled in late March in Westford. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Denise, I had a question. Did you have to make any reductions in your overall budget because of the whole pandemic? I know on this, our side here, public schools, we ended up having to take a $1.3 million reduction. I don't know if overall, between all your districts, you had to take a reduction, or you were able to keep your budget as it was with all the CARES Act money?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dennis. Our budget did remain intact with its initial proposal. It had already been voted by the school committee and had already moved forward in its process. But we have been able to realize significant savings of this budget, including the staff voting a 0% increase in salary, which wasn't expected when we voted the budget. Any excess funds from the budget will eventually become excess and deficiency, which our historical process has been to roll all of that forward to offset the assessment for our towns. So you'll see a savings, but it will be in a different mechanism.
Is there,
Yeah, Denise, we don't have any questions in the chat box, so.
I have a question, Ken, this is
Okay,
Virginia.
Virginia, yep.
And it's just a thought, actually. With the increase in volume or head count each year from Chelmsford, is there any legitimate way to craft a strategic relationship where we may see a per capita break on our assessment? You know, is there any win-win somewhere in all of that that would help alleviate the assessments on the town of Chelmsford? In a legitimate way?
The assessment and the model for arranging the assessment is driven through the district agreement, and that would have to be something that would be agreed upon by all of the towns. Okay. But I will say that Chelmsford has been increasing in enrollment, but what I think you will hear in the coming presentation is that, you know, we may start to see a decline in the town of Chelmsford. I'm aware that your 8th grade class is actually quite smaller than it has been in the past, and we have also noticed that does in fact translate to less applications. So I just think that over the past few years, there's been increased interest from Chelmsford, but I do think that does go up and down from year to year.
Okay, thank you.
And we do have a question from Jim Clancy.
Hi, Denise. Just a quick question. I know you noted, and we're just talking about it, the increase in enrollment from Chelmsford and an overall decrease in enrollment from, did I get that correctly? There was 11 up and 12 down?
No, I'm sorry, I may have misspoke, but we are an overall increase of 10 district students overall. So we're up overall, and the increase from Chelmsford is actually 12 students. So the increase in students from Chelmsford is higher than the overall increase in district students because another town might have gone down. We actually saw a sharp decline in Pepperell from FY21 to FY22. And again, I think it's just the enrollment factors in terms of the number of students in each grade level in that area.
So I guess my question then is, where does that place us in percentage for next year for Chelmsford? And at what point do we increase our membership on the school committee because of that increase?
Those are all great questions. It did increase your percentage, and I will grab the specific. Chelmsford went from 30.58% of our total student enrollment to 31.93%, or an increase of 1.35%. But it would not trigger another seat on the board until your overall enrollment was at 40%, which is unlikely.
Okay,
And that's
Thank you.
over a 10-year period.
thank you.
And when does the district agreement come up for updating?
The district agreement is set.
Is that
And-
like in perpetuity, or is it like for a certain number of years?
It can always be looked at.
I was just curious. Thank you.
Also with me tonight, I believe we have several members of our school committee. I know Claire Janot is with us tonight. I believe Dawn Ayer and Lawrence McDonald and Sam Polton are also with us this evening.
Okay, with that, are there any other questions? Maria has a question. Maria, let's get you unmuted. Maria, you.
Hi. I'm wondering, overall, what has been the impact on your enrollment due to COVID? Has there been any impact overall at all? And do you expect that to change in the coming year?
So our trend here is that our enrollment has actually increased in the time of COVID, and we've experienced no loss in enrollment.
Thank you.
If I no other questions, Dr. Pigeon, thanks for joining us tonight, and to the school board from Neshoba Valley, thank you all for coming on. And with that, we're going to turn it over to the Chelmsford Superintendent, Dr. Jay Line.
Be safe and well, everybody.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Oh, Ken, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Yeah, thank you, everyone, and glad to be here tonight. I know joining me are several members of the admin team, as well as the school committee, if questions come up at a later time. But typically, each year we join and kind of just share a few slides about our current financial situation, what we're looking at for next year, and a couple of different data points that we typically look at to compare ourselves year over year. So plan to do that tonight, and happy to answer any questions you may have. Are you going to advance the slides? Okay, thank you. So just a couple of kind of headers for us as we go finishing out this year as well as entering next year. We're in a good place as far as our collective bargaining agreements are concerned. We do have agreements with all of our employee unions in the school department. So that was obviously very helpful when we're setting our salary figures and putting our budget together for the current fiscal 21, as well as our contracts all run through the end of next year, fiscal 22. So we have all of our salary schedules set, and we're not in negotiations at this point with any of our units. So that's very helpful to us as we put the budget together. Fiscal 21 is actually looking very good. As I mentioned, our general operating budget's in very good shape. I have no concerns about personnel and non-personnel accounts at this time. If anything, we may have a couple of accounts with surplus just due to some staffing this year. And then grants and revolving funds are also in very good shape. I have no concern in fiscal 21 about any of those accounts. So I think that's all good news. We, like the town, did receive some special funding from the state. It was federal money that was passed through the state to help us with our school reopening. That was obviously very helpful. We're hopeful to be getting additional funds in the coming months for next year as well, as hopefully we transfer for the next school year back to a more normal situation. It's certainly not going to cost us any less to educate kids next year as we try to catch up a bit and get back to normal. So that's the mindset we've gone into this with. And at the present time, we've been meeting with all of our individual departments and schools as we look to put our budget recommendation together. Our timeline has been pretty consistent that the first meeting in February of the school committee, which I believe this year is on the 2nd, is when I'll present the school committee with my recommended budget for next year. Then they'll then take a couple of weeks to review and deliberate on it. And we typically get together for a working session, the second meeting in February, which is right after April vacation this year, to go line by line through the budget and talk about the recommendations and the different assumptions that are built into it. So we're still on track for doing that. If we could go to the next slide. So a few different data points that we just kind of look at year over year to kind of see where we stand with both the state as well as our comparable districts. As you know, on an annual basis, the state determines what 10 districts within the Commonwealth are most comparable to Chelmsford based on student enrollment and demographic, number of enrollment, type of enrollment, elementary, middle, high school. And so this year, I think 8 out of our 10 stay the same. I think we picked up 2 new ones this year. But we always take a look at what our overall net school spending is compared to our comparable districts. And you'll see on this particular slide, the 2019 data was the last year that the audited information had come out. And we're obviously on the top half of this metric. We typically, most communities in the state are well above the state average spending wise. But you'll see we spent 36.5% in excess of what our required net school spending was. And that's in the top half of our comparable districts. So I think we're right at about, where we should be spending wise. On the next slide, we'll take a look at the student-teacher ratio. This is something that we obviously monitor from year to year. And again, it's very difficult to take a look at just a number. And what you have to take into consideration is this is just the total student enrollment in the district divided by the number of licensed staff that we have. Different districts obviously run different programs in-house. They may have different relationships with out-of-district schools. Some may retain more kids in district, which is going to have a heavier staffing model, as opposed to if you were to send more students to out-of-district placements, they obviously wouldn't hit your student-teacher ratio. But you'll see on this front, we are actually slightly higher than the state average, but we're right in the middle of our 10 comparable districts. So we have 5 above and 5 below. So that's pretty historically how we've been running data-wise on our student-teacher ratio. On the next slide, another metric that we always take a peek at is our average teacher salary. I actually want to be more competitive on this in the years to come for a couple of reasons. One, we obviously want to be attracting the very best and brightest new teachers or new teachers to Chelmsford into the district when they come. At the same time, we want to be rewarding our existing teachers and our veteran teachers and make sure they want to remain in Chelmsford after they've acquired the knowledge and skills and the abilities that they have to be great teachers. So we have, actually we're in the bottom third on this particular chart. In our last round of teacher negotiations, we did make a decision to augment the teacher salary schedule at the top step slightly. So I think when we get the fiscal 20 data, it might move up a little bit, but this is a number that we obviously watch. And we want to move into at least the midpoint, if not the top third, as opposed to being in the bottom third of this particular metric. But teacher salary is another one of our categories that we pay very close attention to. Which one is next? Per pupil expenditure. Again, this is something that's, it's a good comparison district to district. Again, on this one, you're going to see that we're right in the middle. So we actually spend less than the state average of all school districts per pupil. And this is for our in-district pupil, the average boy and girl that would be attending any one of our 7 different schools. And we're right in the middle of our 10 comparable districts. So we've got 5 spending less and 5 spending more. Again, I think it's a good representation of the education in Chelmsford. We're right in the middle of the comps. We are slightly lower than the state, but this is a trend that we've had happening for a few years now. As I was putting this presentation together, and we were looking at just a lot of different data points, I hadn't typically, but I just wanted to throw in a couple of slides to just show you performance-wise, because we often talk about, how much money we either spend on staffing or students or programming in the district. But I want to kind of bring it back to our performance level, because although, on the spending front, we might be at the 50% mark, half districts above, half districts below per pupil, average teacher salary, obviously we're a little bit lower on that front. But I just want to point out that we continually outperform all of our comparable districts in the state when it comes to academic performance. So in this particular slide, this is just the last set of MCAS scores for our 5th and 8th grade students who take the science MCAS. And we obviously finished a couple of points behind Arlington on this one, but certainly far in excess of the state average score, and certainly, number 2 with regard to our 10 most comparable districts. So again, I just wanted to kind of ground the presentation in some of the money that you're spending to show you what you're getting result-wise. The next 2 slides actually take a look at the high school kids, and our high school kids are really phenomenal. They outperform their peers just about in all categories. So this happened to be the 2019 10th grade English language arts assessment. And we finished obviously 20 percentage points higher than the state average, but we were absolutely the top district with regard to our comparable 10. So I think that's significant. Even the districts that are spending more money than us, we're still outperforming academically. And then on the next slide, you'll see our mathematics scores. We did have 3 schools at the top that had 80%, but obviously we're at the top of that range in districts, followed by the state, again, significantly below, as well as all of our other comparable districts. So I do, when we're talking to the public, talk about, kind of the very good bang for the buck we get in Chelmsford for our education. I'm very proud of the work that the kids do, and it certainly shows in their test performance year after year. So I decided to throw a couple slides in this year just to kind of ground some of that presentation. Next one, Ken. Yep, so this is, again, pretty consistent year over year. It has been, basically costing us about $2 million on average. Some years slightly higher, some years slightly lower, to cover all of our fixed costs for what we would term a level service budget. So some of the numbers that we're looking at this year is about $1.4 million in our wage increases in our salary schedules. This would also include our step increases. We then have funding for our lane changes. So this is for staff that might receive an advanced degree. We always have a set aside as they finish their program, hopefully over the course of the spring. Retirement incentives is obviously going up. This is a net increase over the amount that was in the budget for last year, because we actually offset some of the cost using fiscal 20 money. So we're kind of showing the full effect of doing that here. And then we have a few different non-wage accounts. Again, that's typical. We have some small increases in our student transportation for both regular ed and special ed students. We're entering year 4 or 5 of our big bus contract, and also year 3 of 5 with our special education contract. We have a very small increase with our custodial cleaning services going into year 2 of 3. We've been very happy with the cleaning companies that we have. We have 3 different vendors that are working with us at the elementary, middle, and high school in the district. They, again, have done a phenomenal job, particularly this year with the COVID situation going on in the schools. We did augment their contract and their staffing so that they have a little bit more resources, but I've never seen the schools cleaner, and that they have really gone above and beyond this year. Staff compliments almost on a daily basis with regard to the work that they've been doing. So when you take a look at our wage and our non-wage increases, it's about a $2 million kind of fixed increase that we need for our budget to bring us to a level service accounting for next year. And the $2 million has been pretty consistent year over year. On the next slide. So we currently, when we were going into last year's budget cycle, I had recommended to the school committee, the town manager had included in his budget a $2 million increase going from $61 to $63 million. This was, again, probably in the March timeframe. If you recall at the time, the town manager and we agreed, we didn't know what was going to be happening with our state aid. So to be very conservative, both sides agreed to basically take a look at what a 20% reduction to state aid would be, because we didn't want to over budget or overestimate our revenues. And then we would come back once we actually knew what the state aid was to make adjustments if necessary. So we were asked to make a 1.3 million reduction to the budget, and we did that largely using one-time funding. We had about a little over $1 million in revenue savings from not having to have our school buses on the road between March and June. So at that time, we said, again, state budget's uncertain. We'll apply that money to the shortfall. It's a one-time cut. It's not a real cut to our budget. And then we can reassess at a later time. So ultimately in June, when town meeting went forward, we modified our budget to reduce it by $1.3 million using one-time funding. And ultimately 61.6 was approved. Now, 61.6 was not the real number. Obviously, we didn't cut $1.3 million. So we were under the assumption that we would be coming back to the base 63 and working off that and increasing our budget from 63 to 65. So that's what a level budget within the school department would consist of, not necessitating any type of cuts or reductions to programming and services. As you'll find later in the evening, the town manager is recommending we do go up by $2 million. However, he's recommending we go up $2 million from the revised number of 61.6, not the 63. So we certainly want to have, want to hear the rest of the presentation, but leave open for some discussion towards the end of the meeting about that and the impact that would have on the school department. But that, in a nutshell, are my slides for tonight. Happy to answer any questions and look forward to hearing the rest of the presentation.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
You just did, sure.
Question number 2 then. So as I remember, there was going back to your end of the year, you had the savings in transportation. You for the money for the people that are retiring, you did something about you did the checks early or something. Can you explain how that worked?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, I can explain both for you. So on the transportation front, that was the biggest of the 3 numbers. We basically did make a $1.3 million reduction, but it wasn't a real cut in services. We had accrued savings between March and June because the buses weren't running. And let's just round that off to $1 million. It was in the ballpark of $1 million that we had in savings. So the school department has very limited funds that we can carry over from year to year. So what we ended up doing was transferring that $1 million in transportation savings to special education tuition. And the school committee is allowed to prepay special education tuition. So we basically used that $1 million to prepay fiscal 22 special education tuition, which then allowed the committee to reduce the dollar amount that we funded the fiscal 22 tuition by the $1 million. So it was basically a journal entry to offset those expenses. And that contributed about $1 million of the $1.3 million. The second large account that we were able to pay off is we did have, again, excess funding within fiscal 20 at the time. So we ended up transferring some of that savings. I forget exactly the total dollar amount. Let's say it was a couple $100,000 from the various budget accounts to the retirement buyback account, the separation account. And we paid the separation. The teachers obviously finished the year mid-June. So at that point in time, they've already technically retired. We made the payment in June as opposed to waiting to July, so that payment hit fiscal 20 and didn't carry into 21. And we were then able to reduce our fiscal 21 budget by that, say, $200,000 mark. And that's why you're seeing such an increase now. So if we don't do that again and have money in 21 to kind of prepay that 22 retirement expense, then we've got to at some point account for that. And so that's, that was part of the factor that was in play here, and why our budget typically goes up $2 million a year, but we're off balance here by $1.3 million because we truly didn't take $1.3 million in cuts. It was basically reallocating surplus funds that we had in 20 so that we could reduce the 21 budget by those amounts of money because we didn't have the need at the time.
Let me just ask a question, two kind of follow-ups to that. So the transportation, so in this budgetary year, the one that we're currently living in, what have the transportation costs been? Have there been any savings because of the reduced ridership? I mean, so have there been any follow-up disparities in transportation costs because of the situation? And on the retirement, the people retiring, have there been an increase in number of people who say they're going to retire because of COVID? And when you I can't remember what number it was, 236,000, I think you indicated for the retirement, early retirement benefit. Is that number already factoring in the savings that you get from hiring low versus in person outgoing high?
Yes, let me answer your questions. On the transportation front, no, we're not realizing any savings in transportation at this point. We are negotiating with the vendor around the first couple of weeks of school because we didn't have buses on the road at that time. But obviously the buses were prepared to roll, and so we're in negotiations about how to account for that, what type of savings. It certainly won't be the million. Under contract. They just have fewer students in it because we only have half of the kids basically coming any given day. We have a cohort A, which comes on Monday and Tuesday, and a cohort B, which comes on Thursday and Friday. So our overall, enrollment, the number of kids physically in person has been cut, let's say, in half, but we're still running the same number of buses to get those kids there. They're just at less capacity. But we didn't have the ability under the contract to basically cut down the number of buses. We need to have them on standby in the event over the course of this year where we're either open or we're closed. This is not going to be the kind of year that we're going to see a big savings in transportation. Are you okay with that one?
Yeah.
All right, and then your second question about the retirement monies.
So that was kind of two-pronged. One, have retirement notifications up because of the pandemic? And also, does the number that you show, is it already reflecting the changes in the salary levels between someone who's retiring and somebody who's coming in?
Yeah, so let me answer the second part first, if you don't mind. So what we do, it doesn't get reflected in that particular account. We take the savings from, say, a teacher retiring a top step and getting replaced at a lesser step. We incorporate those anticipated savings into the staff salary book. So those savings actually feed up into the individual salary lines. They don't get offset in the retirement account itself. But what we have done is, yes, we have earmarked that. We typically have been budgeting all of our vacant positions at the master's step 3 level. Again, we don't exactly know what's going to happen hiring wise. That's been a pretty good average of staff coming in to the district and what they ultimately end up making compared to the person who's leaving us. And I would say overall, we probably have a half a dozen more retirements among all staff, teachers, paraprofessionals, whatnot, than we normally would in a particular year. I wouldn't say it's a huge number, and I can't pin that actually on, we don't have a projection of like how many are going out each year because we actually have a lot of staff in the district who are working in excess of what they have to. So they may have already maxed out, but they just continue to work for us. Those staff are very difficult to figure out when they're actually going to retire because they technically could go at any time. But I would only say about a half a dozen more staff than I would anticipate, out of the hundreds. So it's not a significant number that have decided to retire in June. What I will tell you we've had this year, so again, this is going to generate a little bit of savings within our current budget. We have had a number of staff who have taken leaves of absence for the year. That was one of the things that we had negotiated, that if someone just wanted to take an unpaid leave of absence for the year, they could do so. We would basically hold their position for them until the following school year. We have had difficulty filling a number of those vacancies, particularly around the support staff, the paraprofessional staff in the district. So we will see, we'll be doing our mid-year budget report at the next school committee meeting. You will see some surpluses in some of the salary accounts to support those positions because they've basically been vacant. But if we go back to school, and that's what we're assuming, a full return to school next fall, those positions need to be budgeted and they would need to be filled.
I remember from last year, one other benefit that you had last year in your budget was a reduction in the total number of students in long-term out-of-district placement. And that allowed you to do other things within your budget. What is the status of that projection?
I could not tell you at this point in time. I certainly can by the next time we meet if you'd like. I know that our special education tuitions we had adjusted for them in this particular budget. They are trending down. We have not seen significant number of new students being placed in out-of-district placements. I think a lot of that actually goes to some of the additional programming we've developed in district over the last 2 or 3 years. We've been very successful in our STRIVE program, which is our elementary therapeutic behavioral program at South Row. That has been a great district-wide addition. It's complemented it now, the Parker Middle School with the middle school, I'm sorry, at McCarthy Middle School with a middle school level therapeutic behavioral program. And then our Parker Middle School has picked up our autism program. So we're actually keeping in district, which I'm very pleased and happy about, many more students than we historically have. Our special education department will be doing a little update for the school department's budget that we present in a couple of weeks that just kind of tracks some of that information for you. And as soon as I have the report, even before we get to the FinCom and the subcommittee work, I'm happy to forward that off to you so you can take a peek at it. But you'll actually see that our out-of-district enrollment is declining. We're actually spending less on out-of-district enrollment. And that's how we were able to reutilize some of that money. But the money did go to build in-district programming. And I think that's one of the keys that we can't lose in the discussion. The money was basically reallocated from spending it out of district on students and services to building our own in-district programs so that we could do it in a more cost-effective manner, and honestly in a manner that is better for a lot of our student population, to keep them having a connection to the school for the eventual return, if they're able to, in a future year.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to everybody who's involved taking care of our students. But money-wise, without knowing any more details or anything, it seems that if you go with the $63 million amount, you're going to have a structural deficit from what you actually need to operate the school department at current levels. Is that?
No,
I mean, like, so if you don't really have the money within house to make up for the 20% cut that you took last year, I guess is my point.
Yeah, basically, we were looking for the base to be reestablished after the, we'd gone into the assumption that we were going to be looking at that 20% reduction because we didn't know what state aid was going to be. When state aid came in and basically level funded the schools in Chapter 70, we were under the assumption that going into fiscal 22 next year, we were going to be starting from that $63 million, which would have been the original appropriation, and adding $2 million to that. So going from 63 to 65, not going to the reduced amount, 61.6, and adding $2 million off that to get to 63.6. That's where I have the structural $1.3 million deficit. We were looking to go from 63 to 65, not 61.6 to 63.6.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's kind of my general thought process after reading this, and that's why I asked some questions. But thank you, and thank you to all the teachers and staff who are doing such good work with our kids.
Not to belabor this, this has been, probably in my 26 years, the most difficult year that I've ever had to work within. And our staff have been absolutely phenomenal since last March 13th, when we had to go out on, full remote learning. We didn't know for a number of weeks if it was going to be coming back in, not coming in, or whatnot. And even this year, as we switched to kind of straddle between remote learning and hybrid learning, they've been very adaptable. I think our community has been incredibly well serviced by all the staff, the teachers, the paras, and the aides, and the food service workers who have continued to feed all of our families. It's just been incredible to witness what has occurred. I think we're blessed to have them and the dedication that they have. So I've been thanking them ever since, but they're really a phenomenal group dedicated to helping out the town.
Thank you.
Jay, I have a quick question for you, and mine is a very minimal question, but I'm thinking it probably affects a lot of people who had kids go through the school system. I still get an email telling me my son has 25 cents in his school account at McCarthy, and he's a senior this year. At what point do you take that and stop sending the emails?
Well, if you send me the quarter, I'll personally take him off the list, so you won't get that anymore.
I don't think we owe it. I think the money's in there.
No, I'm just kidding. I don't know, Ken. I mean, there must be something in the system that's triggering some kind of an automated email. But, you know, the next time you get one, or if you have one, just forward it to me and I'll be happy to talk to the food group about it. It may just be an old balance that improperly rolled over from year to year or what. But if you just forward me the email, I'm happy to look into it.
All right, that's fine. I'm just wondering if there's other parents who have the same email, and if there's, you know, a couple $100 sitting there and change that you could take when someone, like, you know, if you had a policy, kids graduate, they forfeit whatever's left in the food account, if it's been there for more than 4 years.
Oh, well, I can tell you that people don't typically leave money in the account. It's usually the other way around. So people leave and they haven't paid the debt. But, you know, that is something that we look at. I think historically the school committee every June goes and votes to cover the balance, which we're required to for the financial sheets at the end of the year. But we don't technically remove that debt from the students. We continue, because most students come back the following year. So we continue to try to get the receipts in. But individually, you know, we do work with families. If, you know, a lot of times what will happen is someone, you know, accrues a little bit of debt, but they're in the process of applying for, say, free and reduced lunch. If they end up being approved and it took a week or two, they may have accrued a week or two's debt. And at that point, obviously, they don't have the capacity to go ahead and pay and clear it up. It is something that the school department has looked into. The school committee does, again, take that action on an annual basis. But I'm happy to take a look at your situation. But anyone that has one like that, just, you know, if they email, you know, Nancy in the food service department, Angelini is wonderful, Joanna Johnson Collins in our business office. If they just forward a copy of the email, we can certainly look into them and find out what's going on.
Great. All right, next up, we do have a question from Eric Chambers.
Sure.
Thank you. I guess just first as a clarification, I think I heard a couple, if not 3 or 4 references to the budget being cut 20% last year. The school budget was not cut 20% last year. That was in reference to the state aid reduction, I believe. So I think you and Kathy may have both mentioned a 20% reduction in the budget. So I don't want folks to think that the budget was cut by that much.
Yeah, no, Eric, we definitely didn't cut the overall budget.
Yes.
We were just assuming a 20% reduction in state aid because it was unknown at the time.
Yep, correct. Thank you. Do you know roughly off the top of your head, not to put you on the spot, what the transportation cost is for the year, like roughly for the buses?
For the current year?
Yeah.
Joanna, are you on this call? Would you happen to know that number off the top of your head?
If not, it's all right. I guess, sorry, Joanne, didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. It's going to be, like Dr. Lang said, we are going to adjust for some days, but it's still going to be, you know, close to, you know, 3.5 to 4 million between regular ed and special ed transportation.
Okay, thank you. I guess I was trying to, does that factor in, because I believe under the hybrid approach, no students are in school on Wednesdays. So wouldn't you expect a 20% reduction unless you factor that into the budget? Like, wouldn't you think that you would still be saving about a fifth?
Yeah, well, and that's what we're in negotiations with the transportation company with around now. The hard part is last year when we didn't have any school and we were able to close basically from March to June, we were able to tell the transportation company at some point, listen, we're not coming back. So they basically laid off the drivers, but they're not able to on a weekly basis, you know, get rid of the drivers for Wednesdays, but keep them, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. So we need to basically keep that workforce and the drivers because they're working 4 out of 5 days. That's what we're in negotiations with the company now with. Obviously, there will be some savings. I just can't quantify it for you at this point, but I understand where you're coming from.
All right, thank you. That's it. Appreciate it.
All right, and then we have a question from Anita Tanine.
First off, I want to say thank you to the school committee, the administration, the teachers. I think you guys, and especially in talking to my colleagues at work and hearing about other communities, have done a fantastic job. And I know for one, I was and have been very grateful to all of you for putting in that time and effort. I know it's not been easy, and I know it's not perfect today, but I do know we have the best that we could have had during this time, and I am very grateful for that.
Thank you.
However, what concerns me is, even everybody putting in 150%, I still believe, and it's not a criticism to Chelmsford, but I think it's just the state of where we are, that there are kids who are going to be left behind and have been left behind. And I think especially those with special needs are struggling. And to get us back to a level, to get them back, it's not going to be an overnight project, and we should be expecting to be putting in more. These kids deserve that. I know my oldest, who's in high school, who doesn't have any needs. He's an honor student, takes a couple AP classes. This year has been a struggle for him. And I, as a parent, have the funds to supplement, and I have been supplementing his education so he does not fall behind. I think it's naive of us to think that these kids are just going to bounce back. I think there's going to be a big delta. And again, this is not a criticism at all to the administration, to the teachers, or to the school committee. It is the situation that we're in. So, overall, I'm concerned about not funding, not only next year, but as we go forward, because I think we need to really, look at this. These kids, not only, do we run the risk of, potential, outplacements, which will, compound the issue. But, I think we need to be cognizant of the additional costs that we are going to have to put into the school. These kids deserve it.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments, Anita. And again, people have been working incredibly hard. I think what we are going to see, and again, I'm still in the process of trying to even quantify and put together our budget recommendation for next year. The only thing I can tell you is, as mentioned earlier, it's certainly not going to cost us any less money next year to run the school system than it did this year. We have some very good data already on the students, how they started this school year compared to previous school years. Dr. Hirsch had presented on that at our last school committee meeting. And a lot of our students are keeping up, and they're doing as well as they did in previous school years under a totally different dynamic. But we do have a lot of struggling students, and remote learning has been very difficult for a lot of our students and families. And there is going to need to be some remediation and additional support targeted to meet the needs of some of those students. I do think our special needs population and our ELL population is probably disproportionately impacted by that. So we are going to need to really focus on that in the coming year, and it is going to cost funding. I'm hopeful that there'll be additional resources from the federal government and the state government to help. I think we have a very good, strong foundation for the work right now, but there's certainly going to be additional needs next year that are going to have to be addressed.
Jay, did you see a decrease in enrollment from households who wanted their children in full in-person learning and maybe pulled out of the public schools to go to private school?
We did see a number of students who, typically would be regular students attending in-person learning in Chelmsford, opt to either homeschool. I think our homeschool number a little bit more than doubled. Dr. Hirsch, are you on the call? Do you happen to know the homeschool number off the top of your head?
I am on the call. We have 107 homeschool students. We're up from 35 to 107.
Thank you. So obviously, that's a big number. That's obviously students we also don't get aid from, and we don't know what condition they'll be coming back to us in, a year from now, as far as any kind of, learning gaps that may have developed that will need some assistance or remediation. We also have had a number of students elect to go kind of private and parochial because those offerings do have a full in-person offering that we weren't able to provide. The vast majority of parents who I've talked to, have reached out and indicated that, they're doing this for the year. We're very hopeful that they're going to come back to us a year from now, when we're able to get back, hopefully, to full in-person learning. But we did lose some students, I think overall in the ballpark of about 200 students overall to either homeschooling, private, parochial, a number of different options.
Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, super. Wasn't sure it was going to work. So we're not doing MCAS this year, right? Like we're skipping that whole nonsensical thing. If we can get rid of that, can we put that time that we spend doing test prep and wasting time on like mixed level classes, you know, just sitting around watching movies while the 10th graders take MCAS, can we like recoup that time into doing some of the remediation and, you know, just back to like well-rounded education? Like, can we just throw Peterson out the window at this point?
Well, unfortunately, no. As much as maybe we would like for that to happen, the state did just come out with an edict last week that they are going to reduce the amount of testing time this spring at this point. Now, again, whether when we get to the spring it happens or not, I don't know. But at this point, they're saying there is going to be less testing, not that there's going to be no testing. So we're certainly, you know, kind of watching that as we go. But I don't think we're going to get rid of it altogether. I will tell you, just as a practice, though, and I know this comes up from time to time, we truly don't teach to the test. We don't spend a lot of time test prepping and, you know, kind of wasted time along those fronts. I truly believe if our teachers are teaching the regular curriculum, which we know is aligned to the standards, when it comes time to take the test, the kids are going to perform fine. We don't put a lot of extra pressure on them. Our kids just perform because of the instruction that they get during the regular school day. We, if anything, try to minimize, you know, the talk around the testing. It's not a focus of our work. I guess, you know, that's always been kind of my mantra on it. It's necessary. It's a point in time comparison of how your students are doing. It's one analytic piece to look at. Obviously, it's important because I think communities are rated against each other, which is actually unfortunate in some circumstances. But for our sake, we don't really spend significant time, you know, prepping for it. It just happens, and our students perform well. And I think, you know, in a good school system, that's what will happen. But we are going to have some assessment at this point, it looks like in the spring. But I believe it is going to be a much abridged version of what we normally would have.
All right, Jay, I don't see any other questions in the chat box. Anybody else?
Ken, I'm just going to mention before you move on, I'm losing power on this computer, so I'm going to shut down and turn on a different computer. I don't want you to think I'm leaving you or I've blocked you off. I'll just jump back on another computer in a couple minutes.
Okay. Happy to have you back.
Thank you.
With that, thank you, Dr. Lang. We're going to turn over to Paul, Town Manager Paul Cohen.
Okay, good evening, everybody. And thank you for your time this evening. And got a number of slides to go through. I'll try to go through them rather quickly because I know we're going to have some discussion at the end, just like we've had considerable discussion to this point. And again, part of this presentation is not only to you, who many of you who've been through the budget process in the past and seen my presentations, but also to the community at large. Hopefully, I think the thing if we learned anything during these times is we really need to make sure that we're clear in providing good detailed information to the public. Plus also I come across some nuggets of data that I enjoy passing along the way, and you'll see one or two of those slides. So anyway, first off, just sort of giving a sense of perspective in terms of the budget and where it goes. Right now we have $139 million operating budget. It's a big number, and I think people sort of say, well, where does the money go? This sort of gives you the breakdown by what are our budget funding categories in terms of town meeting and so forth, in terms of line items. It doesn't mean, for example, we show our largest one obviously is $61.7 million, or 44% of the 139 goes to the public schools. Now that doesn't mean that that's the only funding we provide to the public schools, because, for example, the public schools benefits and insurance is found two downs later. That's included in that $25.5 million, or additional 18%. You know, the schools have roughly 2 to 1 the number of employees on the town side, but under Mass General laws and our budgeting practices, we don't allocate those funds benefits and related costs or property insurance and so forth to the school budget, much like a regional school district like Neshoba Tech covers as an independent entity, that's built based into the budget. And same thing with debt service. If there's debt service for school capital or school facilities and so forth, that's all, again, the town separately funds for that. So again, though, when you step back and look at the 139 million, obviously the large chunk of the money goes to the Chelmsford Public Schools. Neshoba Tech has about 2.5% or 3.45 million. And as I mentioned earlier, our second largest budget category is benefits and insurance for active and retired employees. And I'll get into those numbers a little deeper. And then 10% of our budget goes to debt service. And then you can see by the individual departments, police, fire, library, and so forth. Moving on to the next slide, we sort of look at, well, what does that mean in terms of the tax bill? Because, you know, for this current fiscal year, the average single family home has a tax bill of just over $7,400. And so when people cut those checks quarterly, either in person or through their mortgage escrow accounts, again, that same proportion goes to those individual budget line items. So of that 7,400, you know, 3,300 of that goes towards the public schools. And you can see, you know, 1,300 to almost 1,400 goes to benefits and insurance and so forth. Moving along, I take a look at, well, how are things changed over time? In other words, is there any kind of a shift? And I think for the good part is there really hasn't been. You know, things have been relatively stable. Our budget has increased by $20 million or 17% over the last 5 fiscal years. You can see the school budget has risen in accordance with that. By 8 million or almost 8.8 million of that 20 million. Where you see a little bit of an outlier is benefits and insurance, particularly in the area of health insurance and retiree coverage in terms of retirement funding. That has increased, you know, above the 16% by almost 27% or $5.38 million. Those are your big categories. If you then look over the 10-year period, the next slide, again, you've got a $39 million increase over the past 10 years. And you can see, again, the schools are roughly there. They're 37% versus the 38% overall in the budget. What you have seen, and Dr. Pidgeon noted this earlier, we've continually seen over the last decade an increase in enrollment at Neshoba Tech, where that budget has gone up by 86% over the last 10 years, while the town's budget's gone up by 38%. Now, obviously, the numbers aren't the same in magnitude, but it just shows you, where we have to set aside additional funding each year towards that change in increased enrollment. And obviously, per the earlier slide, the benefits and insurance are growing slightly higher, but that's where the big money is. Benefits and insurance is a big category. Again, it's our second biggest number. What you can also interesting see is how debt service has diminished. Over a 10-year period, our debt service has gone up less than 1% compounded per year. Only $1 million we're paying more in debt service than we were a decade ago. And so you can, and again, we'll get into a little bit of which is excluded and which is not excluded in terms of our ability to fund other programs. But the bottom line is our debt is diminishing in time. And that's really because we really haven't had a major project, and certainly not like other communities, a major school project. Moving along, we look at how's the town fund this budget of $139 million. And unfortunately, more than 3/4 of it, in this case, 77%, comes from the property tax, the dreaded property tax that nobody likes to pay every quarter, either directly, as I said, or through their escrow accounts. And you can see state aid is only 13% of our budget. And then there are miscellaneous for local revenues and available funds. Again, you look at how is that changing over time. If you go to the next slide, you can see that the shift is, the burden is falling on the property tax compared to other sources. Our local receipts are essentially flat over 5 years budget-wise, and state aid is pretty weak, and I'm going to get into this a little further. At 8.7%, if you look at a little over 1% compounded per year, it's really not covering the cost of living or the cost of operating in terms of running a municipality, including the school department. Moving on in terms of property tax valuation, this is important to note. We're continuing to see an increase in residential valuation. You can see going back, several years, we were at almost like 80-20, 81-19 to at the point this year we're 83-17. And we're going to see that increase next fiscal year. And talking to our chief assessor, and it's no surprise. If you think about valuation, we're talking about two things are driving that. One is residential property is on fire in terms of the dramatic appreciation of residential values, the hot residential real estate market, and also multifamily development is considered residential. Even though you say, well, that's a commercial property, they lease it as apartments, that's considered and classified as residential. So again, the projection is this trend is only going to accelerate. And it's important because in terms of who's bearing the cost. Going back to the residential, the one figure that we do have and have some measurability is the average single-family property tax bill. Now, again, it's only for single-family homes, but it is a metric that we have that you can look at across most other municipalities across the state. And as you can see, obviously, you go to the bottom line in terms of fiscal 21, the average value for single-family residential home in this community is now $471,000, and obviously that's appreciating. You can see that drives down the tax rate, but really it's not the tax rate you worry about, it's the tax bill. And you can see the average single family tax bill is now over $7,400. And if you look at the state rank, which is the far right column, we're now ranked 72 this tax year. Again, one would be the highest average single family bill. That'd be the town of Weston. And you can obviously get down to 351 cities and towns, but you can clearly see that yes, taxes are rising in Chelmsford, but they're rising everywhere as indicated by our state rank. If you want to look at comparable communities or where we are compared to our peers, taxes are going up in Chelmsford, they're going up everywhere else. And then you can see this year they went up, and you'll see it went up less than, and we'll get into that in a little bit, in terms of what's happening. So anyway, that gives you the macro picture of what's happening. But a big lesson, and this is a message that I don't think can't be emphasized enough, is we're getting the partnership with the state is declining. And here we heard earlier discussion with the superintendent, Lang was speaking, and even Superintendent Pigeon, when she was talking about the paltry increase in state aid that they're looking at. If you look over the last 5 fiscal years, we've got less than a 7% increase in Chapter 70 education funding. Again, that's not more than 1% per year, compounding over the last 5 years. It's pathetic in terms of the partnership. And again, even over a 10-year period, going back over to a couple of governors, you're only up 14% over 10 years. And so again, we say, well, why are the taxes, why is the property tax bearing the burden? Because it can, and it does, because the state aid is causing a problem in terms of state funding. And then even if you get out to the unrestricted general government aid, which used to be called your lottery aid and your additional assistance, that's grown better. And one of the reasons for that is Governor Baker's approach has been to generally increase this amount with the increase in state aid, but yet it's a smaller funding level. So yes, that has gone up 15% as opposed to the 7% in Chapter 70, but it's half the amount. And so it really doesn't help us because, again, when the aid comes in, it isn't segregated. Like the Chapter 70 goes to the schools and the unrestricted goes to the town, general government, so forth. It's all in one state aid pool. And you can see, sadly, if you look back over 20 years, we're actually receiving almost $1 million less in what was called lottery and additional assistance or unrestricted general state aid than we did 20 years ago. So it just shows that the partnership at the state level, where the state mantra has been no new taxes, we're not going to, provide new revenue sources from the previous speaker and the governor and so forth, it has its impact, particularly in a community like Chelmsford that is sort of middle class. We don't have the ability to do overrides, but yet we don't have the need to get state aid beyond minimal funding levels. Yes.
Chapter 70 is tied to this formula that we're wrapped up in. How is the unrestricted government aid allocation determined?
It's, as the name suggests, it's unrestricted. It is just based on historic levels, and then they apply a adjustment factor every year. So basically, when the governor, what the governor has done is, nope. What the governor has said is he's going to fund unrestricted general government aid at the level of growth in the state budget, and it's just a a macro application across the board. So it doesn't change based on your demographics or anything else. It's just been a formulaic approach. You know, the state budget goes up 4.8%. Your unrestricted general government aid in Chelmsford, Weston, you know, North Adams goes up the same amount. Unlike Chapter 70 aid, that is really more tied into your demographics in terms of your, you know, your English language learners and so forth, you know, subsidized lunch programs and so forth. The unrestricted general government aid is just has been a formulaic multiplication adjusted annually. Moving on, and this again was the point that was made earlier by Dr. Pigeon. You know, we're now going into state year 2, fiscal 22 would be the second year of the state's new education funding reform law. This past year, we got level funded, and I know many at the state were disappointed with the funding levels because of the pandemic and the revenue collapse. But as I bold at the bottom line, it's pretty much the same message. It is the same message delivered a year ago. At best, we could expect an increase of $30 a student or $150,000 in total, which is about 1.4%, which is more than again, inflation. Not that cost for education is tied to the inflation metric, because as we know, there are drivers like special ed and other costs, which we discussed earlier this evening. But the bottom line is the state's giving us $30 per student. And again, the state aid shortfall is just continues to worsen. And again, if you go to the next slide, you can see how this means in macro terms. You know, back, 10 years ago, the state aid was 14.5% of our budget. It's now down to 12.6%. And again, that paltry 8.7% or 1.4 million over 5 years, it's squeezing us. And you're hearing the squeezing tonight from Dr. Lang, and we'll get into more of this discussion later on. We're basically carrying this ourselves. But in terms of funding level going forward. Now let's get into some slides of comparison. And again, I don't want to be duplicative of what Dr. Lang presented, but in essence, if you look at our funding, as we noted, we have these communities that are designated by the state. As Jay said, a couple of them are adjusted every year. And then at the bottom, I put our comparable neighboring communities, Billerica, Drake, Tewksbury, and Westford. And the one that we always talk about, we will continue to mention again this year, is Westford. You know, Westford has higher per capita income, has higher equalized valuation of its property per capita, but yet receives basically 50% more Chapter 70 aid than the town of Chelmsford, even though we have greater student enrollment. And that was because the education reform formula of the 90s and early 2000s accelerated local aid to those communities that had increasing school populations, which at the time Westford did because they were maturing as a community, and Chelmsford was static. But the bottom line is, as we go forward, and we're here today, and we've been this way for the 14 years that I've been here, it just shows the inequity in terms of, the Chelmsford-Westford comparison. But sadly, and why do you say, why doesn't that problem get fixed, is that if you look over the entire issue of Chapter 70, this entire list, you can see that we're not at the bottom of the list. There are places, that like North Andover, they're in a worse situation than we are, even though they have roughly the same types of demographics in terms of income per capita and EQV per capita. And why it doesn't get fixed at the state level is because one is the mission is to drive aid to gateway cities and those students who need the aid and the assistance. And there just isn't enough money around to start, levelizing the suburbs. So that's why nothing happens, because if it's a zero-sum game, you can imagine the struggle that would be there. So enough on that. Again, the budget priorities, have continued to be education, public safety, capital infrastructure, and health and human services. Obviously, as we see by the pandemic how critical that is. In terms of school funding, the next slide, Dr. Lang noted, we're 36% over our required net school spending this year. And again, you can see that it's pretty good standing compared to, obviously even the year-to-year basis, but even going back to 16. And I think if somebody like Kathy remembers, when I arrived back in 2006, we were almost at net schools required net school spending. So again, we've made some suggested inroads, but again, we're talking a $75 million budget appropriation. So it's not immaterial. Again, going to the next slide, Jay mentioned about the student-teacher ratio. Again, it went up this year slightly to for fiscal year 20, which is the last year the data is available, last June, to 13.6. And you can saw there was an increase in enrollment for 20 to 19. And so again, that's sort of probably what drove that, because you can see the number of teachers actually went down. You're looking at per pupil expenditure. This was noted earlier. The only point I would add here is if you look at what it is today, the per pupil expenditure for the Chelmsford Public Schools exceeds $16,000. And again, I think that's a message to get out to the community when they say, well, why are my taxes over $7,400? Well, yeah, that's a lot of money, but we're spending $16,000 per student, which is not insignificant. And for those who've got kids into, college or other avenues, it's significant money. But again, that's where the dollars go. Going into the next slide of per pupil expenditure comparisons, as Jay noted earlier, Dr. Lane noted earlier, we're in the middle. And the next slide shows you graphically this chart. This Chelmsford right in the middle of that. You can see that Burlington is way off at the end, and if be interesting to see how they fare in the future with the struggles that they're having with the Burlington Mall and some other communities. But obviously they're at a very good point in terms of their location at 128 and Route 3 in the corridor. But again, we're right in the midpoint, with communities like Westford and Natick and so forth. A good place to be. You look at circuit breaker. This was noted earlier. Fortunately, again, there's been a significant decrease in the number of students eligible, therefore heading out for circuit breaker reimbursement, as well as the claims and costs, as well as the reimbursement. Fortunately, the funding levels remained at the 75% for this year and last year, but that has sort of provided some relief because, again, if you look at the cost we were spending 2 years ago, you're $1 million more. Yes, you get $700,000 roughly in additional reimbursement, but on the other hand, you still get that $300,000 delta. So again, that has provided some relief, and I think it also, again, reflects the efforts and programs that have started in the district, that they do pay off in terms of not only for the students, but also in terms of the bottom line costs. Looking quickly at school choice enrollment, the Chelmsford Public Schools had 41 students this year in fiscal 20. The tuition received was $228,000. The school choice balance is $1.3 million. If you go to the next slide, you'll see where these students come from. As you'd expect, most of them come from Lowell. 33 out of the 41 come from Lowell. If you go to the next slide, you see where the students from Chelmsford going out of in terms of school choice. Most of them go to Westford. Half of them are going to Westford from the from our community, and therefore those dollars go with them. And we also have 100 students enrolled in charter schools, and we were assessed $1.6 million in fiscal 20 for charter school assessments for those students. Average teacher salary, Dr. Lane touched on this earlier, based on the latest end of year school reports for fiscal year 20 from just over 6 months ago. The average teacher salary was $81,214. And again, the 5-year increase was over 10%, which, as Jay noted, over a 5-year increase, the average is over 10%, is not a huge jump. Again, part of your average teacher depends upon your demographics. Where are most of your teachers in terms of the pay scale and turnover that I know Finance Committee member Kathy Dufford mentioned earlier? Most teachers tend to be up towards the latter end of the pay scale. But again, it's a metric that gives you a comparison. Moving on to our enrollment at Neshoba Tech that Dr. Pigeon mentioned earlier, we're up by 11 students this year for the October 1st, 2020 enrollment, which factors into our assessment for fiscal year 22, the upcoming fiscal year. We have a 5-year increase of over 15% or 28 students. So what does that do to our situation? Well, as we noted, if you go to Neshoba Tech, the per pupil expenditure, again, the state hasn't updated its database, but if you look at 18 and you project to 21, we're obviously the cost per pupil expenditure at Neshoba Tech is likely exceeds $22,000 a year. And again, why are vocational schools higher than public schools? Generally, high school education is more expensive than elementary education, and obviously they're running a technology school. So again, just gives a sense of magnitude or cost. Another data thing that I wanted to drive upon is looking at employee growth in the town. I've always anchored on fiscal year 08 because that was sort of the start, preceded the Great Recession of that time. And so I use that as the anchor. It also roughly, approximately just after I arrived, 241 general government employees to 691 on the school side. If you look at where we are today, we're at 250, an increase of about 10. It's in the schools on the general government side, and an increase of about 90 on the school side. And you can see the numbers, again, in the last 5 years, we've added 7.8 or 3.2% on the town side, general government, and they've added 10% or 71 employees in the school department.
How has the population changed over that time period?
Well, the population of the town has been relatively static. We haven't seen the census data. That should be coming out in a matter of weeks. If anything, we know the town of Chelmsford's general population has probably increased because of the multifamily housing. We're probably around 35,000, so we may have seen a few percentage point increase in the Chelmsford total population. Obviously, we've seen a decline in the school enrollment over the last 10, 12 plus years because of the aging of the community, during that period. And again, the enrollment numbers were presented earlier. So again, it just, reflects sort of where things have gone. Obviously with those employees, and we'll touch upon it later on, come benefit costs. And so we'll touch upon that. And then I do have a slide just for inflation to give a sense. Inflation thus far in calendar year 20 has not been a problem that we're driving with. A few years back in 18, 17, it was trending higher. Fortunately, that isn't a question. So again, as that background, we sort of look at, well, where are we going for fiscal year 22? Again, the philosophy I think to this is we're hoping in 22, which again starts next July and runs through June 30th of 2022. We're hoping that we're exiting from the COVID-19 pandemic while we attempt to maintain the quality of our local governmental services. And we have to meet these fixed cost increases from labor contracts, retirement, and health insurance, much like we heard earlier from Dr. Lang and from Dr. Pidgeon in terms of, that's what the cost drivers are. And now we'll get into those. The first one being Neshoba Tech. Again, with the enrollment increase, while the district that exceeds the total member growth of the district, the town share has increased from 30.58% to 31.93%, and Dr. Pidgeon referenced that earlier in her presentation. If you just took this year's assessment to Neshoba Tech and applied that change in the percentage share based upon the enrollment, our assessment goes up $152,000. So that means if their budget were to stay the same, we have to spend $152,000 under the agreement because you pay per student. I mean, that's the agreement. And again, it doesn't talk about Chapter 70 money, which, again, that's getting into like multiple iterations. But the bottom line is, if I'm now planning a budget, and again, I haven't received any information from Dr. Pidgeon or any of the regional members and so forth, but as I'm sitting here trying to project a budget, and I've got to release under our bylaws, I got to release a budget in 2 weeks. What am I using? Well, I'm taking that 152 because I know our enrollment's changing, and if the district's budget for Neshoba Tech increased by 3.25% last year, well, I'm figuring they're around the same range this year. So I'm using a number of 3.725 million, or roughly a $280,000 increase, or 8.12% into my cost drivers. And again, if that ends up being 290, 265, whatever, it's not going to material. But the bottom line is, that's a driver. 8% increase, 280,000 is significant. Going to employee compensation, as Dr. Lang noted, the schools have their contracts in place. We still have 2 outstanding contracts in the town's case. One being with the police sergeant that's going back now 4.5 years. The last contract expired in 2016. We're now in 2021. So it's 4.5 years, and we're a year and a half behind without an agreement with the Public Safety Dispatchers Union. But if you set aside the 2% contractual increases in the pay scales as well as for non-union employee compensation, then on the town side it's roughly $500,000. You saw on the school side it was well over $1 million, and again they have roughly twice as many employees as the town side, so those numbers sort of make sense. If you look at yes,
with respect to the sergeants union, do you see a need to allocate any extraordinary expenses related to the litigation that's not covered by our insurance?
No, because one, I don't think there'll ever be a litigation resolution. And second of all, our charter prohibits the town from appropriating money in advance of a contract settlement. Okay. So I think the short answer to that question is no. Hopefully this will get resolved soon.
I was referring to our legal expenses that we are incurring now.
Oh, you used the word litigation. Legal expenses are in our legal budget. We're doing okay with that budget. Again, those are one-time expenditures. When the agreement gets resolved, those costs go away. And the reason you make that one-time investment is we see what happens if a 2% increase on the town side is $500,000 in the general government, and then the school side is over $1 million. You can see why we sit here and work hard in the bargaining, because you can see how those costs pale in comparison to what the impact would be town-wide of settlement costs. Everybody would like to give everybody a lot of money and pay everybody, as Dr. Lang noted, higher and where we'd like to be in the pay scale. Unfortunately, there's a significant cost associated with that, and it's a cost that that does matter. Every 1% or 0.5% does matter when you're dealing with 900 employees. And again, we're a service organization and our costs are labor driven. That sort of spells out where it is. But in related to that is the cost of employee and retiree health insurance, which is our next slide. We're at this point we're using a 5% number for health insurance, and I guess the obvious question is, well, wait a minute, Paul, isn't health insurance down because of COVID? And the answer is yes. Utilization is down, but the information that we're receiving is health insurance inflation is not down. And so, like you said, we may be in a lull right now, but when COVID passes and services resume and people make up in some cases for lost time, or in some other cases have more severe medical situations as a result of postponing or delaying, that's the number that we're at. So the other thing that's driving our premiums is the number of retirees continues to increase significantly. So if you go back to the previous slide, you can see I'm using a number of 7% or $925,000 for employee and retiree health insurance. And now if you go to the next slide, you can see what's really driving this is the growth in our total subscribers, but most of it from retirees. You can see the bottom right, in fiscal 21, we have 932 retirees. Go back 5 years, we had 873. Go back 10 years, we're 786. On the town side, in terms of active employees, general for everyone, school and town, we're level where we were a year ago, and the numbers, it's almost like, I guess it's a blessing that with medical care and so forth, that retirees are staying longer and enjoying their retirement, and the numbers are swelling. The bottom line is it's driving our assessment. And you'll see it when we get into the Middlesex retirement assessment in a couple slides. But first, in terms of premiums, just to give again an order of magnitude, the current HMO family plan, not talking our most expensive, indemnity type plan, but the current HMO family plan, right now the annual premium is $25,000. The town pays 75%. You factor in a 5% increase for next upcoming fiscal year, the town will be spending over $20,000 for a family HMO plan as the town share. That's significant. Again, not that our healthcare costs are any way out of line in terms of, well, why don't we just shop for a better plan and so forth. We are at the state directed, group insurance commission benchmark level of benefits in terms of copays, deductibles, and so forth. But you can clearly see that healthcare, as we all know, is expensive, and goodness knows what the future brings on this as we move forward. But coming back now to the next slide in terms of retirement assist. Yeah. Yes,
question on the healthcare, because now that rate, can you just kind of explain a little bit how much we cover for retirees in that?
The town pays $75.25 for active employees, and retirees is $63.37. The town pays 63% of the premium. Now, retiree premiums tend to be less than active employees. I don't want to minimize that because they're obviously on individual retiree plans for themselves and or their spouse. But the town pays 63% for retiree plans. Where it gets expensive are the early retirees. Below Medicare, i.e., less than 65. That's the hard spot right there, because the town's paying 63% for someone who's a retiree below the age of 65, and those premiums are roughly the same as an active employee. So you're talking 20%, 20,000.
Is this contractual? Like, are we required to cover employee and spouse and at those rates?
Well, it can be bargained. The state allows you to bargain between 50 to 90%. We're at 75% for active employees. That could be bargained. Could it be successfully bargained? Same thing. The retirees.
Just because knowing in industry, right?
Same thing. Yeah, same thing.
75% is
the town is 63.
Level. That's about normal.
The town is 63% for retirees. The town is required to be between 50 and 90% for retirees as well. That can technically be altered by the select board, by a vote of the select board, but practically, you'd have hell to pay, because what you're doing is you're basically changing a benefit for those who are retirees on what, as we commonly refer to it, as a fixed income. And even though you read in the paper about the high level of retiree earnings for certain state officials and so forth, the average retiree earning, and John can help me on this one, I think it's less than $30,000, right, John? It's like $28,000 or something, the typical retiree pension on the state level. So yes, it can be changed technically, but practically and politically, it's a different thing. I believe that these
paid for a retiree?
63% of the premium. 63.
Right, so it's actually, when you do the numbers, it's a double whammy, because if the rates for the retirees go up 7%, and you want to shift from 63 to 70%, that's 10% increase on top of a 7% increase. It's a double killer for a retiree. So because the health insurance keeps increasing at those rates, it's almost impossible to shift the rates to the retirees.
That's why you rarely see it happen in Massachusetts. It doesn't happen. It happens once in a rare occasion, and when it does, it's a very challenging period. I think the only community that comes to mind who did something in recent years was the town of Andover, and I still don't know if the wounds have healed from that battle. It's a very difficult item to address.
And what about that early retirees that's costing us a lot of money? The only reason why is, not for anything, folks in the industry who retire, this is not covered for them, right? This is on their own. They have to have enough 401k to pay for this. So, trying to balance it all, I'm not trying to pick on the retirees, but, like to discourage those early retirements, I guess, or,
we don't have the ability to discriminate between retiree classes, so we can't say, for this level of our retirees will pay 63% and that will pay 50%. It's uniform, but the state requires it to be uniform. Okay. So moving on to Middlesex retirement assessment, our scheduled increase this year is just under 4% of $371,000. If you go to the next slide, there's a lot of good information on there, and also some disturbing information. This is the 10-year updated history and analysis, and you'll see it goes through 23 because the retirement system does a 2-year assessment. They just completed it. So you can see on a normal cost, for a normal cost of retirement, it's not bad, 1.7. You can see it, it's increasing, but that left column isn't too bad. That 2002 early retirement incentive, that went away, 4 years ago, so we're no longer paying that. But the key one is that column that says payment on unfunded liability. And you can see that number is just exploding. So if your total assessment of 10 million, go to the 22 line, your fourth column of 10 million, 8.3 million of that is for the unfunded liability. And you can see that this year it increased by 180,000. And then look what happens next year. So we're not talking next year, but look what's going to happen is this presentation a year from now, that number is going to go up by over $600,000. So this year's change of 371 in 22 that starts this July, when a year from now, as we're looking into 2023, that goes up $655,000. So we'll be cutting a check this year for almost 10 million to Middlesex County Retirement, and next year it'll be 10.5 million. And we don't have any choice in this. This is mandated by state law, and it's not going away anytime soon. And the number of factors are driving that. It's the increased lifespan, longevity for retirees. It's the declining returns on investments in the market. They used to assume like over an 8% return on market, and obviously when those returns aren't happening, they're dialing it back down now to below 7%. But every time you dial that down, it bumps up your unfunded liability because your return on earnings is going down. So again, this is, and you can always see, if you go back, you can look at every second year it jumps, right? We were 655 in 23. If you go back to 21, it was 639, which is above the 543 for the year before. In 19, it was 506. That went up well over the 270. So again, it's a 2-year. And again, what they try to do is smooth it, and then you get whammied on the second year. So again, not good news on retirement. And continuing the trend of not good news is solid waste, recycling, and disposal. The next slide. We've got two things going on here. The collection costs, which are basically the people who pick up recycling and solid waste at your driveway, that cost is going up about $80,000 or 4.37%. Again, that's because of the prevailing wage increase schedules that are set by the state in terms of union wage schedules and so forth. Obviously, it's we're seeing incomes and wage earnings increase, which is what the state uses for its metric. But more importantly, and we've talked about this for a few years, there is a shortage in New England and really most of the country of solid waste and landfill opportunities. And basically nobody is opening new landfills. They're not building expensive trash energy plants that have environmental regulations or any other solid waste disposal alternatives. And so what happened is our contractual cost to tip a ton of solid waste at the facility in Haverhill is going up by 20%, from $74.50 a ton to $90 per ton. And it's not because just that plant. If you go to the facility that's over in North Andover, it's the same rates. We shopped this, we bid this in a collaborative. We even looked at shipping the stuff to Ohio by train and so forth. And there's just the market, and this is an unfulfilled need that's just worsening over time, because more and more landfills are closing, and some of the existing plants are aging and need to be retrofitted. So it's just, and then the other thing is the pandemic resulted in increased residential solid waste. So when people were staying at home instead of going to work or going to eat in restaurants, that waste we're paying for to tip as opposed to if it's a restaurant, they're paying for the cost themselves. So again, we're looking at a $400,000 increase in disposal costs. So the total is $480,000 for collection and disposal. The bit of good news was on excluded debt service. To the next slide, the town's excluded debt service, which is primarily the phases of the sewer project, That's decreasing by over 12% to 460,000. However, this doesn't help us in the operating budget because that debt is excluded from the provisions of Proposition 2.5. So it's debt that was voted for that purpose, and then once that debt service gets paid down, as it gets paid down, we can't use that money anywhere else. But it is good news because it obviously provides a little bit of relief in the tax levy. Couple other miscellaneous cost drivers as we conclude here. Property, casualty, and workers' comp. The big one here is the property insurance market across the country is increasing because of the increased replacement costs for buildings, and obviously the whole market is just driven by the cost drivers, the wildfires, everything else that's going on out there. Also, you've had significant changes and increases in premiums for law enforcement and public officials liability insurance because of the climate that we're in. And then our workers' comp grows with our employee payroll. So we've got a $50,000 increase, or 5.25% for this number. And then the last one is Medicare tax. Again, we pay it based on our payroll. As we noted, if our payroll's going up, so aren't our Medicare taxes contribution. So that's 46,000. So you come to the summary slide of cost drivers, we're at 465 million from where we are. Obviously the big ones, just like we saw in the budget, big ones where the money goes are school department, health insurance, and again, employee compensation, of which obviously is rolled in the school number, but also on the general government side. And we talked about solid waste, retirement, Neshoba Tech. We now look in the revenue side. Look at the property tax revenue. This is the available new capacity. Now I'm using the word new levy capacity, not what we taxed from next year, because we didn't tax at the full amount last year. Remember, this past fiscal year, we'll get into this a little later, we were $2.9 million below the levy limit. That was $2 million because we used $2 million from our stabilization fund to provide the pandemic relief. And then we were $900,000 below levy limit of unused levy capacity. And it was noted earlier, the state aid came in better than was forecast when we were at town meeting in June. And even in October, when we didn't adjust the budget at all, when Darlene submitted the recap sheet following the 2 town meetings and following the tax classification hearing and everything else, the state had the town use our actual local aid numbers from the state, not the ones we estimated back in June, but the actual ones. We were, at the end of the day, we were $2.9 million under levy limit. So coming to the revenue, what do we have for new capacity going forward? Well, you got the 2.5%, you go to the far right column, second line, 2.5% of 106 base levy is 2.6 million. And then we're estimating 1.6 million in new growth, which is, again, not the peak of where we've been the last 2 years, but, traditional, more normal year for growth that's going to go over the next 6 months. And that's the best number that I have from the chief assessor at this point in time. So you add 2.6 and 1.6, you get 4.25.
So
you go to the next.
The 4.25 assumes that that's the 2.5% that's available.
Yes, that's the 2.5% available. We'll get into what does it mean for levyability in a couple of slides, but that's what we have available. In other words, new levy capacity. Didn't say new levy, but it's new levy capacity is 4.25. You now go to state aid, the next slide. Basically, we're level dollar state aid. I'm sitting here today, the best feeling I have is it's level dollar, and yeah, it may fluctuate, but the big numbers there are Chapter 70 and general government aid, as we talked about earlier. We're using 11.2 million. We're using level dollar. Again, in the best case, it could be $30 per student, 150,000 out of 17.5 million. Again, we're in sort of the noise area. And same thing with general government aid. I don't see any change. It'd be interesting to see what happens with that when the governor releases his budget next month, what their projections are. And because what we're hearing and what you're reading is state revenues are faring much better than they ever forecast during the pandemic in terms of the close of fiscal year 20 last July and the first 6 months of fiscal 21. However, the prediction from the Department of Revenue of the state and their economists that they rely upon is that is going to change in the next 6 months. We'll have to wait and see. But at this point, I'm using level dollar. And again, the other ones are minor numbers. Those are the big cost drivers. Moving down into, again, I want to beat this point home, and I'm doing it. If you look at our Chapter 70 funding history, you can just see how paltry it is. $150,000, the $30 per student. It's basically been with us forever. And again, if you look at it in terms of the percentage increase, you can see that is, it's no way near comparing to the real costs and real expenditures that we're using for education. And in 21, it was zero. And right now in 22, I'm using zero. But again, if it's $150,000, okay, but that's not going to solve the $1.3 million number that the superintendent and school committee members are talking about earlier. It's just amazing. Anyway, going into local receipts, here I'm being optimistic, and I like to be optimistic. So I'm projecting a 7% increase in local receipts. You say, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm assuming that when this economy opens up after COVID, again, starting next July through June 30th of 2022, I'm assuming you're going to see a couple things happening. One is if people are going back to work, you should see some little bit of a bounce in motor vehicle excise from basically people who may not have done anything with their cars unless they were on lease, to maybe having to make an investment that they could have forestalled because they were not commuting much. Also, same thing with meals tax. I'm assuming that's going to bounce back to $500,000. Now, again, it's not that I don't realize that many restaurants are never going to reopen, but I think there's got to be a boom from when people can finally get out of their house and either go on vacation or go out and eat and join and gather. So again, I'm being hopeful and trying to be optimistic. Same thing with permits. I'm bumping that up from the current budget estimate we have this year to $1.1 million, and on room and lodging, the same thing. I'm hoping a bounce back that, again, as people travel and visit and see people they haven't seen and go places, that we'll get some room tax. So again, I'm looking at a $632,000 increase, or 7% in local receipts. When you tie that in together, you go to 92, slide 92, you can see that that's $4.89 million of additional revenue, or 3.5% from the $139 million budget that we're on this year. You now go to, how does it match up with the numbers that we talked earlier? You can see they're roughly balanced, within, striking distance of each other. Because again, we're only talking drivers. We're not into the weeds at this point. And again, with not any in-service enhancements or any additional employees, we're roughly at 4.8, 4.7, somewhere around there moving forward. Again, going back to the school increase, as Dr. Lang noted, and I put this in here, again, for discussion purposes, I'm using, a 3.25% increase from the current funding level in the schools. I don't have the $65 million number. And one of the reasons is, and we'll get into this, is that $65 million number I don't think is attainable. But we can discuss that when I wrap up. Another slide I had, we talked about this in terms of enrollment. This is from the state's website, the enrollment figures for the 1920 school year and the 2021 school year. And it was mentioned earlier, and I'll touch upon it. If you look at that, I mean, obviously you can't draw much from pre-K if you start in the left-hand column because of COVID. But strikingly, our kindergarten class was close to where it was a year ago. And then if you start looking, if you go down diagonally, you can see what happened between grades. And you heard the macro numbers that were mentioned earlier in terms of the student loss and changes in enrollment. But the one that I focus on is between 8th and 9th grade. Last year's 8th grade class of 400 students is this year's 9th grade class of 358 students. We lost 42. Obviously, some of them went to Neshoba Tech, and some of them are probably homeschooled, and some of them went to parochial schools and so forth. So there's a decline. Look at this year's 8th grade students of 359. You're probably going to have a 9th grade class next year of somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 students. Or in the low threes, 320, somewhere around there, which obviously would be the smallest class in the high school. And you can just see the disparity that you're seeing between the graduating classes at the high school of 373 this year versus 320 330, whatever number you want to use going in. Now, the ironic thing is it seems to be like a bubble because look at this year's 7th grade class. You go back up to 393 and then 383 for this year's 6th grade class. So for whatever reason, there's this bubble. And I think maybe it's tied back to that recession that we talked about, because if you add 8 plus 6 and 14, you're around 2006, 2007, the time of the Great Recession. But you can clearly see that there's this dip in enrollment for basically what's going to be, next year's freshman and sophomore class, or this year's 8th grade and 9th grade class, in terms of the numbers compared to what's around them. So again, I just pointed out because it's just interesting to note as I was crunching data, the extraordinary small enrollment of the 8th grade students that are likely to attend the high school next year. Could be down to 320. On the same side, as Dr. Pigeon noted earlier, it may also put a temporary hiatus on our enrollment at Neshoba Tech and enrollment growth at Neshoba Tech, because we just don't have that number of students coming out of the 8th grade this year. So anyway, it was an interesting bit of data that I stumbled across as I was crunching these numbers. The other thing I want to touch upon is slide 96 here is there are some things outside of the operating budget that, and the first one is the most important. We are undertaking a comprehensive inspection, assessment, balancing, and repairs to our HVAC system in the Chelmsford Public Schools. We don't have that number yet, what that's going to entail. We were on a call today, Dr. Lang, myself, Gary Persichetti, Kathleen Canavan, and so forth. There's going to be a need there, and probably will have to be borrowed and so forth. But we've done a great job maintaining our systems, and believe me, it's a heck of a lot less costly than it would be to build, or expand or what have you. But there's some investment that's going to take place there. We're looking ahead. There's been discussion about continuing the renovation expansion of our satellite fire stations. Right now we're doing north. The next one online would be west. And then there's still the unmet need of the outdoor tennis and basketball courts at the high school, which was $1.3 million, which did not get funded this year because it didn't make the cut in terms of priorities. But the problem and need doesn't go away. It's going to need to be funded at some point in the future. So let me conclude in terms of the issue of property taxes, because it's always about the property tax. I want to take a moment to look upon what happened this year, and we're the second community there. And you can see that red number. The average single-family tax bill in Chelmsford went up $49, or 2/3 of 1%, to $74.11. We were the anomaly this year. We provided the one-time COVID relief. Most of our peer communities are joining us went to at or near the levy limit, and you can see those numbers. Billerica's tax increase, average single-family bill was 2.5%, $141. Drake's was $148, over 3%. The Tewksbury average single-family bill went up over $231, 3.34%. Westford's went up $176, 1.91%. Because we applied $2 million from the General Stabilization Fund to provide relief on the property tax during this pandemic. Before we leave this chart, there's some other good data here. I mean, you can see our average single-family home values aren't that disparate between Chelmsford versus Tewksbury. Obviously, we know values are lower in Drake and higher in Westford. But if you go to that fourth column and show per capita income, and then the fifth column, and obviously the growth in per capita income, if you look at from 1 year, but if you look at the fifth column of tax bill as a percentage of income, ours is the lowest. So again, when I read the social media and hear all the discussions and everything else about taxes are driving people out of this town, well, you know what? They're terrible everywhere. And if you use your measurement as a tax bill as a percentage of per capita income, then Chelmsford's not faring too poorly. The problem becomes, what do you do for an encore when we've applied this $2 million from the stabilization fund? And if you go to the next slide, I'm sort of drawing this out, and the $2 million in the stabilization fund reduced the average single-family bill in Chelmsford by approximately $140. So that's the old rubric, and it's still in a case. Every $1 million in taxes is $70 on the average single-family property tax bill. As I mentioned earlier, we were also 900,000 in excess levy capacity. So again, our total levy capacity with the actual state aid that was funded, we were 2.9 million below levy limit. Now, you look at this and how did we get to the 900,000, and not touching on the school side and not touching on police overtime and other stuff, but we cut our OPEB contribution to the liability for those who come after us by $400,000, and we cut the snow and ice removal budget by $500,000 from $1.5 million to $1 million. What I'm suggesting is that at this time for the upcoming fiscal year, the fiscally responsible action may be not to assume any contribution from the General Stabilization Fund to reduce the property tax levy and to return to recent funding levels for unfunded OPEB liability, which is an intergenerational responsibility, and for snow and ice removal operations. The $1.5 million, again, is more typical of what we expend. So if you go to the next slide in terms of what would that mean? Again, your average single-family property tax bill for this fiscal year is $74.11. You provide a 2.5% increase as allowed under Proposition 2.5. That would be $185. Now you put aside the $2 million in General Stabilization Fund that we did, the one-time COVID relief, that's $140 or 1.9%. And then if you utilize the excess remaining levy capacity, that's another $65. And then if you got the shift that's I talked about earlier in the presentation, that you're continuing to shift, that even if you did the same budget, you shift to from commercial to residential value, that's another $30. So now you're looking at your average single family property tax bill could be somewhere over $7,800, or an increase of over $420, or roughly $40 a month, or 5.7%. That's staggering. So in conclusion, and we can just jump over the summary and conclusion slide to go into the conclusions. The drivers resulting in no operational changes. Local aid from the state has significantly diminished. I'm expecting level funded Chapter 70 as a result of the pandemic. If you go to the next slide, John, the town is and continue to be reliant upon the property tax. I don't see any significant future increase in state aid. Employee benefit cost increases are not going to diminish. The number of retirees continues to increase. We need to be mindful of adding any additional benefited positions to that total. And again, the extent of the recovery from the pandemic obviously remains uncertain. So on my final two text slides, the budget goal by the select board is to establish a fiscal year 22 budget recommendation that raises the tax levy below the 2.5% levy limit, while slowing the rate of increase in resident and local business property taxes, and to work with the tri-board, select board, school committee, and finance committee to establish a revenue target. And being mindful of that, here is my recommendation in conclusion. I would recommend that we establish a revenue target of $144 million in accordance with what we've outlined this evening. And then I think at the fall annual town meeting, when we know more about the fiscal conditions of fiscal year 22, at that point we'll be a few months into it. Obviously, we're talking 9 months from today, that the town then discuss and address whether and how much its free cash and stabilization fund could be applied to reduce that property tax levy increase. The problem this has, and to bring it all the way full circle to what discussions we heard earlier about the Chelmsford Public Schools and their numbers and so forth, I'm mindful of that. But the thing you got to bear in mind, and this is a struggle, and based on my 30 years of experience and Dr. Lang's experience, it doesn't really help to give money to the schools in October and at town meeting at the end of October, because at that point everything is pretty much set in the district, unless there's some anomaly in terms of special ed out of district or other things. They're not going to add teachers in November after we complete town meeting and so forth and so on. But bottom line is, what I'm suggesting is, we provided the relief where we are in this pandemic, and I'm saying is when we're coming out of this pandemic 6 to 18 months from now, we go back to status quo and then look at, is there a way to bridge out of there? Now, the problem is, and the discussion we're going to have is, how do you bridge out of there at the same time when you've got these structural deficits that also need to be bridged? But the bottom line is, remember what I've been repeating, we're 2.9 million under levy. 2 million of that is the 2 million that we applied from stabilization. So if you remove that, you're only 900 below levy limit based on actual state aid this year and actual budget funding levels. And again, that's the only number. And again, what I'm suggesting macro is look towards OPEB it being an intergenerational responsibility and perhaps snow and ice. Even that 900,000, if you put aside the OPEB and the snow and ice, it doesn't go to the 1.3 million that the schools are looking for. And again, I think the villain here, the culprit of all this is we are sort of bearing the burden by the inadequate level of state aid, and it's catching up to us. So with that, I'll end my conclusion. And with a reminder, my last slide is I have to produce a recommended budget 2 weeks from now, which I will do and present to the select board on the 25th, and then distribute to the school committee and finance committee and go from there. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just to be clear, the 144 million assumes you're using the entire 2.5% capacity?
Yeah, all levy capacity. That's correct. And then, like I said, if you want to go below that levy capacity, then what I'm suggesting is look at it in the fall. I don't know what we're going to finish with free cash this year. And also, the other thing we don't know is, and one thing that may be a ladder out of this situation is we're being told that with the new administration coming in Washington in 9 days, that they're going to provide some municipal and state relief and financial support. And I know Dr. Lang mentioned it in his presentation as well. That may be the ladder that gets us somewhere. But remember, that's going to be, once again, probably a one-time ladder. But that may enable us to bridge the struggle that we're dealing with right now and then revisit it or so a year from now. But that's the one wild card. Well, two wild cards. One is what relief will we get from the new administration and Congress in Washington in the months ahead that will enable us to move forward? And then also, what's the economy going to be like? I'm trying to be optimistic and hoping that there's, as people are projecting, a boom, following this pandemic. But those are the unknowns. But I think that's the best advice or insight that I have at this point in time.
I have
Anybody
a
else have any
couple
other
of
questions?
clarifying questions, I guess, if nobody else is going to go. Paul, you didn't talk at all about every year the road infrastructure comes up as a concern.
Yeah.
So how is the Chapter 90 funding calculated, and do we have any influence over that we're not tapping into?
Well, the Chapter 90 story is worse than the Chapter 70 story. Chapter 90 state funding has remained level dollared for municipalities for the last 8 years, with the exception of the first year, 6 years ago, when Governor Baker came in. He said he'd throw in extra money, and he did one time. We're receiving the same $1.2 million in Chapter 90 funds that the state has provided us for basically the last almost decade at this point. And the reason is that comes from the state gas tax. And there's two problems with the state gas tax, short-term and long-term. Short-term, because there's no will in the legislature to adjust or increase the state gas tax because they get hammered when they do it. And you may recall a ballot repeal that happened a half dozen years ago when they tried to index the state gas tax like the state pay raises for the legislators to the rate of inflation. That got repealed. So it's now a third rail issue where they won't touch the state gas tax for Chapter 90. The other problem is the increased utilization of non-gasoline powered vehicles, which don't pay any gas tax. So there's a long-term problem the state's going to have, that as you get more and more electric vehicles on the road, none of which pay any gas tax, that they're going to have to transform from a gas tax funded formula to a miles driven or some other formula. And you can imagine the hysteria when that hits. So that's the short and long-term crisis with Chapter 90 road monies. I had hoped, and again, I would, and maybe what the Congress does, we don't know what they're going to do. What they did back in the 2008 recession is they funded shovel-ready projects, and many of those were road construction projects. We don't know what form of assistance the federal government or what magnitude is going to be, and that could be one solution towards roads, but it's very disappointing. It's very clear. We're getting less than half what we need to fund the town's roadway infrastructure, and that's why the condition does not improve over time. And also, even though we funded in our capital budget with those additional funds, it's not what we need to keep 230 road miles in good condition.
Are there grant programs or other sources of funding for road work, or is that pretty much it?
Well, most of them are state funded. I mean, we are in the Complete Streets program and others, and we do apply and use those monies, but it's in every year. And if you just look at the transportation bond bill that the legislature just sent to the governor, everything was included in that transportation bond bill except for Chapter 90 funds, because the legislature left that out deliberately so they can vote it annually every year, because they like to vote it every year because it makes good press that they voted monies back to the district. But it just hasn't been helpful. So no, there really isn't any secret solution out there in terms of how we get more money into the roads, unfortunately.
So I guess just a comment from a philosophical standpoint. And I wasn't the original advocate for this goal, and I don't want to speak for that person, but my understanding of it may not necessarily have been that we're going to sustain the $2 million that we put in from the stabilization fund, but that in general, we would try to start looking toward budgeting and fiscal strategies so that we could maybe ratchet it down a little bit from the 2.5% assumption. And so, do we think about things or do we factor things in, like giving departments a challenge on efficiencies to take cost out so maybe we can operate a little more efficiency? Do we give people, you're always giving us great news on grants that have been awarded. Well, are we building some kind of objective into our goal system to have people try to bring in some, really stay on trying to bring in some of that grant funding to subsidize a little bit? The other thing that's come up in the past, I know, is like, are there just fiscal models within our town that we should look at? For example, how the CCA utilities are funded every year, and is that a model that we want to sustain, or do we want to change it? So I understand all the constraints that you've gone through. I don't know that the philosophical objective was to say, let's stay, let's keep putting stabilization money or free cash against the budget, but is there a way that we could at least start trying to ratchet it down a little bit and come up with some other strategies in terms of our expenses and the revenues that we're pulling in, or like I said, some of the models in terms of how we pay for things? So, and again, I wasn't the advocate for this, so I'll stop there.
I have a question for Virginia. Can you hear me? What do you mean by ratchet it down?
So
are you talking about laying off people in town or cutting services?
The thought process was that, Paul, do you have the objective? You can flip back up to the screen.
John, can you go back up to the budget goal, right? 103, I think.
Yeah, 103. So the discussion that the select board had was that every year we assume we're going to spend to the full 2.5% tax levy. And
right, and employees get what percent raises?
What we were trying to do is be responsive to a lot of feedback that we've gotten, that is there a way that we can look at slowing the rate of increase on those residential and local business property taxes, because we start from a premise every year that we're going to exercise the full property tax levy. And so are there other things that we can look at that will help bring us down below that? Ken, I don't know if you want to clarify.
Not really, but I will.
Okay.
No, we threw around a goal for Paul of a budget goal to come in under the levy limit. It was that general, and I think in a conversation that Paul had with us in one of those meetings, it got sharpened up a little further. Obviously, you know, we get a lot of feedback as the select board about how brutal the property taxes are, you know, and how much they keep going up and going up. So, you know, that's the goal that came out of that work session, was to try to come in under the levy limit.
Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, I do understand that you guys are elected board and it's important for you to worry about being elected again. However, it's 2.5%. That's the max that we can go up. What you're proposing then, to cut and stay beneath that, is cut services. And you need to be clear about that. I'm not debating this, but when you're only giving people, you know, 2% raises, and not, you know, providing infrastructure, we're cutting services. Listen, you know, my taxes keep going up too. I understand that. However, I also get trash picked up. I can move to Concord, no trash pickup there. Move to Weston, no trash pickup there. You know, we have a great senior center. You know, I think it's, you know, listen, I've seen a lot of companies cut themselves right out of friggin' business because, oh God, you know what? We can't make our numbers, we're spending too much, so let's cut. You need to be careful. When when you're playing to, you know, getting elected again. And, you know, I get it, and I think there needs to be a mix, but we have to really look at the services, what we're providing. Are we providing that, you know, across the board equally to as many people as we can? And, you know, what do we want to sacrifice? But I think you guys need to come up to the plate and be clear about what you plan on, you know, what you're recommending to sacrifice. And if you guys want to sacrifice the school, that's fine, but you need to say that.
I appreciate your input, Anita. And there's, I'll remind you, there's 2 seats open, so feel free to join in.
I think there's going to be a race this year.
Yep. You know, I don't think any of us that talked about the financial budget were up for re-election, so that's probably not a worry of who had that discussion. But no, that discussion was very clear when we had it with Paul, that services, if over time, possibly would have to get cut if that stayed in effect long term. We hadn't really had a discussion about what services yet.
Question for Paul on the residential, because we did the split, you know, commercial to residential. Do we know what percentage, and maybe you can get back to me, we have commercial complexes, right, that are owned, because our number of, you know, single family homes versus multi-family homes, which sometimes are owned by a commercial developer because they're rental facilities, but they're still being priced at a residential rate. I'd like to understand, like, the evolution over the last 10 years.
Yeah,
because, you know, obviously by doing the split, it's, you know, you're taking the average, and I get that over, you know, average tax bill, but to a single family owner, you know, single family homeowner like myself, you know, that split, you know, maybe coming back a different way than incentivizing people to invest in commercial, may not impact me as much as people would think, because there has been a huge shift in the increase in multifamily developers in this town.
Yeah, I'd have to sit with the assessors and really mine that data to get a handle on what that is in terms of the growth. I think realistically, most of our residential value is single-family homes or condos, and again, it's what's driving it now. Valuation is price appreciation, more so than new development and so forth. But it's the market, in the same way the market is tanked for office space, so forth. It's really market forces that are driving most of this.
Yeah, we're shifting in the wrong way again. We're shifting back towards a higher residential percentage over a CIP. And part of that's pandemic driven, part of that's small business issues. And I fully respect and understand that. But again, if we're shifting that way and the assessed values of residential properties are going up, the taxes are going to go up. And so with the goal of the 2.5%, as I'm hearing tonight, this budget's 144 million proposed, does not include the 1.3 million, which is missing from the school budget from the previous year, and it taxes all the way through our full levy capacity. So I'm not sure where the fat is, and I'm not sure where the cuts can be made. And I think we sounded the alarm a couple of years ago, and we sounded alarm again when we had this. I was asked this question at the town meeting in the fall. You know, what does this look like as far as reducing the tax levy when it jumps the next year? And the answer was, we could tax straight through the capacity limit, and we may have to, because we need to meet the level of services. And if we're not talking services, we're talking employees. We're talking employees and their benefits, which is a large portion, a considerable portion of our budget for the town. And so we have to look at both of those areas. And if we're not taxing to the full limit, which is under the purview, which is what we've done in the past, then we're looking really hard at cutting services or reducing employee count, because that's where we have to go. I don't see an increase in local receipts, a huge increase in local receipts. And I think Paul's numbers are optimistic, and I hope he's right, but they're optimistic. And so if we're looking at the full budget picture here, it's not fantastic, and we're not dealing with, I don't think, a whole lot of fat to cut. So I'm just not sure how we accomplish a goal of going beneath the levy limit without addressing it in the fall when we have certified free cash, as we've done in the past. We look at it and say, okay, maybe we have more money has come in that's unexpected. Maybe we've had an increase in revenues that we couldn't forecast because there was a banner year at some level, shape, or form. Maybe we're receiving more federal aid, which I think is a pipe dream, but may happen. And so we look at the free cash value that we receive at that time, and then supply potentially a reduction through that method. But we have other issues we need to fund for the future too. Our capital issues aren't going away. Our capital needs are not going away. And our buildings aren't getting younger. Additionally, our OPEB liability and our assessment for Middlesex, as we saw earlier this evening, are increasing, and they're going to continue to increase. So, I mean, again, I'm not sure where fat gets cut, and if we cut fat today, what's going to look like for us in the future.
John, if you go to slide 86 on the FY22 budget drivers, you can just jump to that slide. And I think this is a point that does, if you look at these, which ones can we really go into? We can't touch the Middlesex retirement, 371. We have a contractual obligation on solid waste and recycling. The Neshoba Tech, it's based on enrollment. Property insurance casualty, again, that's market driven. And the Medicare tax obviously is driven by payroll. So what you end up being left with, and the health insurance premiums are the market. And maybe the market will come in at 3 rather than 5, we'll see. But the bottom line is the big drivers are personnel, and that's general government employee compensation and school department, which is largely employment compensation as well. So you just got areas of the budget that you can't get into in terms of budget drivers, as well as others that are like debt service and so forth. We can't touch those either. And so it's easy to, sometimes it's, people look at it and say, well, you got $144 million. Well, just cut 1% or whatever, and you're there. like I said, there are a lot of areas that you can't go into because, when you open the doors, those costs are there. And so that's the challenge that we have. And it's a struggle. And like I said, it's not that we haven't been taxing ourselves enough. It's the partnership with the state, which, forgetting aside that we're not getting enough of our Chapter 78 compared to other towns, we're just not getting any kind of an increase on the paltry amount that we're getting. And that's finally coming home to catch up with us. Not just us. We're not going to be the only community in this situation. It's going to be many communities who are struggling going forward.
If I could just tag on to what Jim said and Paul said, the idea of not taxing to the whole levy limit is alluring and tempting, but the reality is that we're driven by these numbers. And we can kind of forget the judgment thing. It's factual. If you want to have the services, and by services, we're talking police, fire, your streets plowed, all of the things that happen in this town for all of its citizens, then you're going to, at this stage, and I can't actually foresee how it would change in the future unless suddenly the state starts giving us some money, factually, mathematically, you're going to have to go to the 2.5%, and in this case, our total levy capacity. Otherwise, you are going to have to make cuts, and they're going to have to be massive. Now, there's some number, I don't know, is it $30 worth of savings on a person's tax bill for $1 million of cuts, whatever the number is. But that number to the individual is not going to outweigh the benefits to every individual, including our senior citizens. And I empathize greatly with the fixed income and the increased residential income taxes. But in this case, it really is math, and the math drives it. We have been abandoned by the state for years. Inflation is a factor. It's a fact of life. There is no, cost cutting, revenue generating. Let's go back to 2008. We set up these two committees. I can't even remember which one I was on, but I don't know if it was the cost counting or the revenue generating. There is no thing big enough to overcome your issue unless you really slash. And that is going to have a detrimental effect to us many years forward. So although I can identify and feel for the taxation issue, the math, the logic, you have to go with the 2.5 and all the capacity, because otherwise you're not going to be able to do it.
Eric, you had some questions. Did you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. So I'm glad I waited now because I've heard other folks speak. I guess what comes to mind as we talk about cutting services or maintaining, and I know this got some discussion last year. The school department added 10 people for this fiscal year. They added 10 people the year before that. So, the problem is that the state aid is dropping. It's that we keep hiring more people. I think if you looked at the school enrollment, it's been flat to slightly down, yet we're adding people on the school side. On the general government side, we've added 2 people in the last 2 years total. So it's not a matter, to me, it's not a matter of keeping, your head above water. We keep adding more water to the bucket ourselves. We can't blame that on anybody else except for ourselves. Paul, you had the slide up for this current year, the average tax bill went up by, I believe, 2/3%. The average valuation went up by 5%. So it's both sides of the ledger. It's not like people's houses are worth less and they're paying more taxes. They're benefiting because their valuations are going up. Since this started either going back to the beginning of last year, Paul, calendar year, so January, or even if you think of when the COVID kind of kicked in March.
John, it's
across the
slide
town-
97.
Across the town, either on the general side or on the school side, have we had any reduction in staff, either through not filling vacant positions, furloughs, layoffs? Has anybody had a loss of headcount?
The simple answer is no.
Okay, so I think that's interesting, and all that we hear about the tough times that we're dealing with, our town has maintained its service level. And I also recall, or I guess I should say I don't recall, during the discussion with the school budget last year, I never had in mind that we'll do this 1.3 reduction, but we're going to give it back to you next year. That was never my understanding. That was never discussed. That was a reduction. We come into this year, we have to start over. You don't just add that back automatically. That should be part of the debate and the decision making of, you got to reassess where you are. I think that's part of the times we're living in. So more comments than questions, but the last one I have, Paul, is do you happen to know, this is going back in your presentation, when you had the average per pupil expenditure of about 16 grand, what that number would be as if it was fully loaded? Like if you took all the benefits, insurance, debt service, what does that number, how much does that add to that? Any idea?
No, that is the fully loaded number. That number, see, that number comes from the Department of Revenue, Department of Education, technically Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. They take the end of year school report that's submitted by the school department and signed off by the town accountant that allocates all of the true cost of education, including benefits, including the support services that we provide, such as facilities and so forth. That is a total comprehensive number. That's not our budget line. That's the total number.
Okay, thank you.
And that way you can make comparisons across the state and across communities because you're using the same metric as opposed to how towns may differently establish or budget their costs. So that is holistic number.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had, Ken. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Dr. Lang, hold on. Dr. Lang's in the queue before you, John. So if you don't mind.
Thanks. I just wanted to point out a couple of things and a couple in response to Eric as well. We have been adding some staff in the school department over the last number of years. I've been doing that living within basically a $2 million increase, somewhere around a low 3% increase each year, which very much like the town side, we've been providing about a 2% COLA increase in our contracts, and we have very little wiggle room beyond that. I indicated that, we have made significant strides over the last number of years to build in-district programs to basically lower the number of costs we have with students choosing to leave the Chelmsford Public Schools or requiring to leave the Chelmsford Public Schools. But I can't build those in-district programs without staffing them appropriately. I don't have it in front of me, but most of my employees that got added last year were to build that behavioral therapeutic program at the middle school level. I want to say there were 6 or 7 positions that were dedicated to that. Thankfully, we also added an additional computer, given the COVID climate that was going on. I've got 3 computer repair technicians for the entire school system, serving over 5,000 and up-to staff. So I certainly don't feel we're overstaffed. I've been able to work within the budget to accomplish what we've done. I definitely have a different recollection of the $1.3 million cut last year. We had, the school committee had approved, I had recommended, even town manager Cohen had recommended our budget to be $63 million before all of the COVID stuff hit come March. We then all agreed. We didn't quite know what was going to happen with the state revenue figures, Chapter 70 and any other stuff. So when we went into town meeting in June, we said, let's assume worst case. Let's assume a 20% reduction in state aid. It was apportioned out. The school department's share of that was the 1.3 million. I think the town's share was $1 million, somewhere along those lines. There were other adjustments, that were made. There was some stabilization funds made. And we said, let's do this thinking this is worst case scenario, because as Paul had mentioned earlier, once the school year gets started, it's very difficult for me to adjust staff. I can't just go and make a reduction of a teacher come September or October. So we want to know we're going into a school year properly. And we said when we get the final state aid, at that point in time, we'd revisit things and see where we're at. we're totally fine with that. We were actually sitting on that savings in the transportation, and I don't want to go asking for more money than I need. That worked for me. It worked for the school committee. We were happy to go along and do that. I think what I'm surprised by, and I'm still trying to figure out, is we didn't have a 20% reduction in state aid. This fall, when state aid came in and it was basically level funded, we didn't have to, or wouldn't have had to have made that reduction. We could have gone with our regular programming. I wouldn't have had to use one-time money in 20 to fill a budget in 21. And, you know, when the town manager had come, and we talk often about different needs. If I ever need something, I feel very comfortable reaching out to him. We try to work together and we fill the gaps as we need them. When asked this year if I needed extra money at that point, no, I didn't, because, you know, we had plenty of money for the year. I had different grants that were coming in. I never thought we were going to be resetting the floor to that $61.6 million number. We never saw the hit in state aid. We never saw a reduction in state aid. I'm assuming that that's just going to get built in, and our budget's going to work off of 63, which is the real number we had. It's 63 going to 65. You know, we were at 49 a couple of years back. We went to 50. I'm sorry, 49, 51, and right up. We've been going $2 million a year for the last number of years. So that very much was my recollection. And again, I think what ended up happening is when the money came in, it wasn't necessary at the time. It was used to somehow, and Paul can explain this, but lower the tax rate. And that's why we saw partially tax relief this year, which is fine. Again, we didn't need that number. We weren't under the impression that the flow was being readjusted and that was going to negatively impact us for years to come.
Jay, what doesn't happen with the 1.3 million?
Well, I guess that's my other issue with this, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around that, is we're doing our individual budget presentations and meetings. And I know one of the last slides that Paula presented was around to get this joint agreement about this revenue figure and, you know, a level service budget. Well, a $1.3 million cut isn't a level service budget to the school department. It's going to be a reduction in services. It's going to be a reduction potentially in staff. I now have to go back to the drawing board and look at all of this while we're putting our budget together. But there certainly isn't a situation at the school department where we're now talking level service like the town side is talking. If this is a true $1.3 million budget cut, I've got to go back and figure out how to deal with that.
And can I just, Jay, do you mind if I jump in real quick?
No, it's up to Ken.
Ken, would you mind giving me a moment?
He said, okay.
Oh, John, you were up next, so please do.
Yeah, I think I just want to say that, and I can't speak for the rest of the committee, that's up to the chairman, but I think our understanding was not that we would take this $1.3 million, which we all willingly did. We all knew it was the right thing to do, unprecedented times, and use our own cash from other savings to do that. I don't think anybody had the expectation that that would be the new baseline. And I don't think that's in good faith to even say. I'm just going to be really upfront. We have kids in this town struggling. We have families struggling. And we're talking about $1.3 million. I mean, we have kids having trouble reading. We have kids that had to homeschool that can't get food. And you're talking about setting up a new baseline for a budget. I think that is not in good faith. And I don't really appreciate that. And I can't speak for other members, but I think all of our understanding was this is a one-time emergency that we had to handle, and we stepped up and we did the right thing. So that's my comment. $1.3 million cut is just not in good faith. It is not a new baseline. And I don't think we should be reducing services in the year after a pandemic where kids had to learn from home and parents are struggling and kids are having trouble reading. Just like Anita had said, we've all had to supplement with our own money our kids' education. So while I understand that these are tough times, I don't know if taking a $1.3 million cut, and that's what I'm going to call it, is acceptable. Thank you.
So the second part of my
question. I'd like to speak because I had COVID symptoms. My child had been.
Emily, I actually put in the comment so I could speak after John.
You tell me when I can pitch in, because this was done during a meeting I wasn't.
Can we just hold on?
Anita, I just would like to finish the question I started. The second part of my question so I asked Jay, what does the 1.3 million mean? My question then is to Paul, what does giving Jay the 1.3 million back mean to what
You're not
you're.
giving it back. We used our own money to do that. You're not giving it back.
No. What
All
I'm
right, guys, we have to
what
go one at a time here.
Paul
So-
is saying is that his budget assumption or his recommendation doesn't include that 1.3 million. And what I'm saying is, if you leave the budget recommendation alone and include the 1.3 million for the school committee, what does that do to your other assumptions, Paul?
Well, we'll have to move. I want to make it clear. On the town side, you remember, we cut public safety overtime and so forth. The budget that I'm looking at, and I've been working with department heads, doesn't move off that. So I want to make it clear. I didn't say, schools, you take your $1.3 million cut, we'll go back to status quo. We're all sort of starting from the end point on the general government side as well. So if, to answer your question, Virginia, if we need to reduce funding, there's a couple ways of doing it. You know, again, go back to the 900,000. We can not fund OPEB, and again, kick a liability down the road to the next generation by underfunding. You know, what is our planned schedule of $1.4 million as opposed to funding it at $1 million, which we and you see how that works so well with the unfunded pension liability of what that's going to do to those who come after us. It's basically living beyond your means. And then the other one is, okay, I'll cut snow and ice, and that's fine because we can legally overspend that. So that'll give you $900,000. Well, I guess that leaves me with $433,000 as a balance. And again, realistically, some of this is uncertain. Let's recognize where we are. We don't know all the information. Again, this is January of a year, but we've got to go forward with something. And so we'll have to make assumptions, but the bottom line is, if you want to come up with $400,000, $430,000 and fund it into the school department, then you're right. All those other items that I just spoke about are I can't go after. So the bottom line is there'll have to be cuts in the general government side to fund that. And again, if we're not funding adequate, realistic, not only snow and ice numbers, but we're not funding public safety overtime to where we're going to be and so forth, then what we'll do is we'll just get by, because by law we have to have a balanced budget. And so therefore we would have to look at, and you say, oh, Paul, don't throw the police and fire, you're using scare tactics. Well, you know what? Where do you think the money is on the town side? The three biggest departments on the town side, which constitute most of our spending on the general government, is public works, police, and fire. Okay, everything else is paltry. I can't go into the assessor's office and say, sorry, we're laying 2 out of the 4 people off, but please complete the property tax assessment and get the bills out. And the same thing in the collector's office and so forth. And talk about IT. I've got 2 people running IT for the entire town. And the same thing. We're not overstaffed. Certainly, I'm not going to go into the Board of Health department, given what they're going through, and cut the health department. We've gone through this and we've had these discussions at the select board meeting. My own office is understaffed compared to my comparable towns. I'm running with an interim town manager, assistant town manager, and 1 HR person, and 1 clerical support person, support services person in the entire office. I would ask anybody to go to any town, Westford, Tewksbury, Drake, and find comparable staffing levels. So the bottom line is, why do you sit there and say, Paul, do you come back to police and fire and DPW? Because that's the only place where there are bodies.
I don't think I said that, Paul.
No, I'm not saying it, but I'm trying to explain. You're asking me where it's going to impact. Where it's going to impact, it's going to be there.
At the 144 million recommendation, which raises the levy to the 2.5%. It sounds like we're still in a shortfall of $1.3 million in terms of services somewhere, whether it's town or school.
But no, the 1.3 doesn't do it, because if you're going to use the town side, you're probably at 1.7, 1.8 because of what we cut. So I just very cautious about throwing out numbers, but let's not assume that the entire deficit here, if you're looking at where we would like to have been a year ago, is on the school side. There are adjustments that were made on the town side as well.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
Right.
That's
And
all.
so the bottom line is, what are we going to do? We're going to have to push our way through it. And again, as I said, when we talked about this, the 2 million, I'm not saying at the end of the day, don't use any stabilization fund, but let's recognize what we did, folks. We used 2 million and we only put back 800,000. I'm sorry, 1.2 million. So there was a net loss of 800,000 to the stabilization fund in terms of the funding going in and out. And yes, it does earn some interest, but the end of the day is, you don't want to repeat what the town did back in the 2000s, where you drew down your stabilization fund to the point where you lost your bond rating, and people from the Department of Revenue were in the building saying, what's going on in Chelmsford? And so that's why I'm ringing the bell early, which is my responsibility to do.
We're having conversations about cutting services, and at the same, on the other side of your mouth, we're saying that we're talking about not taxing to the levy, right? So I would gladly pay, and I think a lot of taxpayers and parents in this town would gladly pay all the way to the levy to maintain as many services and as many jobs in this town as possible, because there's people out of work, there's people on unemployment. I don't know who.
John, I appreciate what you're saying, but we have a line of people.
I'm speaking. Let me finish, please. I let you finish. I don't know where you came up with a plan to not tax to the levy when you're talking about cutting to services. There are people out of work, and you're talking about people's jobs. We stood up an entire food program to keep the kitchen workers employed. What are we doing? What are we doing?
Paul, I have a quick question for you. Looking at this, so if you go to the full limit, does that solve all your problems?
Well, it depends on what the problems are. Well, I mean, I think we could. Well, I can't speak on the school side, but I can speak on the town side. And Darlene gave the report earlier. We're living within, and Jay said the same thing on the school side. We're fine for this coming year. And I think if I go with a level service budget, which is what I'm talking about on the general government side, I can get there. Basically,
when you say level service budget on the town, are you assuming that the 1.3 goes back to the schools or no?
No, I said the town side, general government side, not school side. I don't have the means and the levy capacity to appropriate $1.3 million to the school side. And I am not going to bring to town meeting a unbalanced budget. We did that one year and it didn't fly. So the end of the day, we'll have to come up with a number. I'll sit with department heads and the finance director, John Souza, and Darlene, and figure out a number, because in 2 weeks, under the bylaws, I've got to put out a budget. So I will put out something. But I can tell you, I've already met with all my department heads. There's no adding. I mean, it was the most uneventful budget discussions you can imagine, because it was just like, look, folks, there's nothing here. Just tell me what you need to fund in your COLA adjustments to your contractual obligations, and then any extraordinary things which we pointed out to you in terms of solid waste and so forth. And that's pretty much the whole budget. So there's to do that, there would have to be some reductions in services. There's no other way around it.
The only thing
this is coming up the first night that we probably have seen all of this quantified in one report like this. So clearly, we have a little bit of work to do, and we can talk about, what the options are here. Was it your assumption that the 1.3 million was, like, I wasn't part of that discussion, but was that a permanent?
Who's the question directed to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's directed to you, Paul. So the school gave up the 1.3, or however you want to word it. Was that? I mean, John saying, the school committee saying that it wasn't their understanding that was a permanent reduction in a budget.
I honestly, my sense is we evaluate and reassess every year. I'm not going to say that, that was a temporary provision. What we heard at the time was they had extraordinary relief from the bus contract because of the COVID shutdown, and they were going to apply those monies, and they were going to do prepayments to their bills and the end of the year, including the teacher, buyouts and so forth. So yes, they were using, one-time issues to balance, but I didn't know at the time, and I still don't know at this time, if there might be some of those that could be in play this year. In terms of, I don't have a close enough handle to sit here and tell you if they're going to have some ability in terms of, what their special ed budget for out of district is versus what it actually is in terms of their budget. If there are other issues, I just don't have that insight at this point in time to say, oh, they can do this or do that. Again, I mentioned something about, and I talked to Jay about this in passing the other day. Well, look, if you've got declining enrollment in the high school, maybe there's some positions by attrition that don't get filled. I mean, think about it. If you're not funding a $40,000 position and a $20,000 benefits with that, $65,000, you start having a couple positions, you're talking some real money. You're talking six figures with a couple positions that don't get filled because of enrollment changes and so forth. That's what I'm saying. So I had no definitive answer in terms of, was that going to be the new ceiling? All I can tell you is I take the town's budget as it is right now, look at the $2.9 million in excess levy capacity, look at what happens and what we have going forward, and that brings me to where we are today. And there were things that were beyond our control. For example, we had $500,000 in overlay, the amount set aside for abatements and exemptions. At the end of the day, when the town submitted the tax recap sheet to the state said, oh no, you've got to fund that at $731,000 to have money set aside for abatements and exemptions. And so there went another $250,000, because I'm sure there's people trying to figure the math saying, well, where's the 20% versus the 2.9 and so forth. It's those kind of factors. The other things we know that are moving is issues like, circuit breaker reimbursement from the state, charter school assessments. Those numbers can move by six figures, and that becomes the variable. I don't know, John, do you have anything else in terms of thoughts on that, in terms of your sense from a year ago? John Souza?
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Yeah. No, I think that covered it all. And we had you mentioned overlay. I think there's just been a lot of it seems every year there's always fixed costs, such as we weren't counting on, if we stood here a year ago, we definitely weren't counting on that dramatic increase in rubbish disposal costs. Even though the Middlesex increase was higher, that's coming, we've been told to expect 6.5% increases down the road as all towns work to pay off that unfunded liability. So that's going to continue to be a big number. I'm just trying to recall other instances.
And even in the Neshoba Tech enrollment number, we didn't realize that till within the last several weeks, once the October 1 census data. I mean, I don't think any of us knew what was going to happen when COVID in terms of enrollment at Neshoba Tech or even the Chelmsford Public Schools. And so I was kind of shocked to see that once again, our enrollment was resulting in that kind of an impact in terms of, once again, our enrollment was exceeding that of the entire district. And that's 2 years in a row we've done that. So, I mean, those are the type of things that we didn't foresee.
And can I just jump back in for 1 second?
Jay, is that you? You want to?
Yeah, oh, it's Jay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to touch briefly. I mean, I think, I can't speak obviously for the town budget, but obviously this year there's going to be some play in the school budget, because I mentioned we've got some accounts that are underfunded, very similar to last year. I'm sure, as Paul and the town have free cash, we basically have, it's not free cash, but it's surpluses that develop in different accounts. We try to use the money wisely. That's what we did last year to try to, help offset some of these costs. We're still very early in our budget process too. So, I mean, things will change. I don't know what additional state, federal revenue will come in. We don't know what circuit breaker for sure will be. There are a lot of variables in play. I think, and in my talks with Paul, I think just the big thing from our side is that, there is that structural deficit that's in the ballpark of $1.3 million. And it's something that, maybe we can whittle down over time. But if you had to ask me, today we had to resolve this because we're not going to carry or we're not going to prepay anything going into 22, it's about $1.3 million that we're off. So, I mean, that's kind of the number that we're working on. And Paul had mentioned that there was $1 million on his side that he was kind of working through. Obviously, there's little tweaks every year. Something costs more, something costs less. It's just, this is the point of the budget we're in. But that's what I'm kind of dealing with at this point. And I just wanted to just mention that.
To maybe help this out, my suggestion would be, and I'll throw this out there. You may recall we delayed. I'm sure you recall we delayed town meeting till June last year because of the uncertainty with the pandemic and the state and everything going on. My expectation as I stand here today is that's probably going to happen again, and because of two things. One is at the rate of vaccination and immunization that's going out there. I don't see how we gather anywhere in April for town meeting. And therefore, we may be better well served to look towards the last 2 weeks of June, like we did last year, although it's probably going to take more than one session this year, to address the budget and deal with things. Because two things will happen. One is I think it helps us in a better COVID environment because, again, the further we push out, the more comfort there will be in terms of immunizations and immunity as we go forward. Also, if you're meeting in June, you can have the doors open and the distancing and so forth like we did in the gym last year, which you may not be able to do in April. And second of all, if you look out towards June, whatever assistance may come from the federal government should happen by then. Because if you're going to give the administration the first 100 days, we probably won't have enough as a finance committee would normally wrap up the budget by the beginning of April to have any awareness and ability, but we may by, if we push that back, 2 months and now wrapping up the budget beginning of June to go to town meeting and the third week of June, that may be the relief valve or the time that we need to get a better handle on where things are actually going. Because the last thing we want to do is cause a lot of anxiety and strife and other things that may not be necessary if there is, something coming our way. And again, the more time and information we have, we'll know more in June than we will in April. So that's the only suggestion that I have in terms of, the process.
Legislation that allowed us to move to June?
Oh, no, we're allowed to, we would do like we do, we would do like we do last year. You sign the warrant for the town meeting, and then the chair and the moderator go there in April and then recess it till June. We're required by the state to have the budget in place by June 30th. And you need that, again, for the schools to be doing hiring and everything else. You've got to get everything done. And again, assuming the pandemic is subsiding at that point, we don't know that there would be any further extensions or if what the state will do with its budget situation. But I think that may be the prudent thought to have at this point in terms of, let's allow some time and some, and again, if there is something, and again, we saw this in 2008 in the Great Recession, there was that stimulus money that funded the schools and the town through a very difficult period that made it a lot better than it otherwise would have been. And so rather than creating situations that may not come to pass and the difficulties that go with that, it may be better to just sort of have in our minds that, let's be targeting June rather than April. So it's a thought.
Well, we may end up having to do that anyway, just for like the practical purposes of COVID and everything.
Yeah.
The only two things that we had to do it last year, we had no alternative. It's not great for the school department because we've got a lot of May 15th notifications in our contracts as far as hiring. I know that's outside of our control, but it's not ideal. The only other thing that really impacts negatively, I know it impacts the whole town, but a little bit more the schools, is the capital budget. Because if we're not getting capital approved until June, we don't have the lead time to be able to bid projects. And within the schools, we really just have that 8 or 10 week summer period to try to get the projects done. So the April money almost really works to our advantage because we can get projects bid and quoted and out and get the work done that particular summer. Again, I know there might be nothing we can do about it, but it just puts our capital projects off to potentially a vacation week or another school year. If we wait till June again, we kind of saw that this past year. I know it's out of our control, but Jim, I think you have your hands up.
So if I can clarify, as the budget is presented, it was a little loud, sorry, Paul. As the budget is today, the proposed budget is 144 million, which taxes all the way to our levy limit capacity. The budget does not include the 1.3 million that was taken out last year from the schools, but it also does not include a certain amount of money baseline for DPW, public safety services, things of that nature on the town side. The only way to include the 1.3 million would be to subtract somewhere else, such as OPEB liability funding or something of that nature. But in no way, shape, or form would we be able to tax below the levy limit in order to meet the current unfunded proposition budget, but also the fact that we are still 1.3 million below where the school committee and the school administration expected to be. So we're looking at potentially a June town meeting, although I understand, Jay, your concerns about the timing of that, although it may be out of our hands anyway. And so if we're looking at the June, would it be prudent to look at, if we put the 1.3 in now, what do we take out on the other side? And with the understanding that we may get funds in sometime in the interim, again, pipe dream, not something that we can certainly bank on. But if we're putting 1.3 in, what does that look like on the other side? What has to come out in order to do that? And will it be feasible? Will it be possible? But I think we need to all agree that not taxing to the limit's not going to be practical or possible.
Paul, when do you have to present your budget?
The bylaws say I have to have a budget produced 90 days prior to the beginning of the spring annual town meeting, and that's basically the last Monday in January. So basically 2 weeks from tonight. Again, doesn't mean that has to be the last number. I mean, it's not written in stone, it's written in ink, and it can be modified, but basically I am scheduled to produce something in 2 weeks, release something in 2 weeks, which again will be refined just like we did last year. It may not be what ultimately makes it to town meeting, and when town meeting is ever held.
In between now and the 25th, if we assume the 144, you and Jay could get together and do some work to see if there's any reconciliation at all that can be done with the disconnect.
Yes. I mean, we'll all regroup. You know.
I mean, this is tough because you're dealing with so many unknowns, but
that's life. Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I mean, you know, the items that are to come out, they're the ones that came out last year. We'll cut the snow and ice, we'll cut the OPEB, and we'll trim, and then Jay will look at what things he may be able to have this year that he can prepay. I mean, you know, it's you know, we've seen this movie in a little bit, but you know, those are the things we'll do. But it doesn't, like I said, what we need is a target. And like I said, what I'm asking for is a revenue target of 144 million as a rough number, as a target, you know, because we have to have something to anchor from. It may end up varying from that a little bit in the end of the day, but I think we at least got to know what we're striving for, because otherwise it's you know, it's a Herculean task if we don't have a anchor of which to move from.
So, Paul, for a decision tonight, you're looking for a vote?
Yeah, in accordance with the select board's goal is the goal was, as per that slide, is a revenue target.
And Donald Newcomb wants to say something.
Yeah, just that I wanted to reiterate what Paul and Jay were saying about that. I think that there's a lot of information that's really still unknown. Mm-hmm. And I know that Paul had mentioned several times that our enrollment numbers were dropping. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not really sure I know where our enrollment is going to be as we approach the end of the year. If things look like they're getting back on track In other words, we're going to be back with full in-person learning come the fall. I actually expect to see some of our numbers rise. I expect to see some of our homeschool kids maybe re-enroll back in the public schools. And it's entirely possible that some of the kids who chose a private option will also return to the public schools. So I do think that I do think there's a lot of unanswered questions at this point, and I think we need to make a list of things, certainly on the school side, of the unknowns and what the you know, what the impact will be, you know, financially for us, you know, if there's a positive outcome and if there's a negative outcome. But you know, I do think that we need to proceed very cautiously because some of the things that we are obligated to pay for are not within our control. And those would certainly be staff salaries, but also special education costs. And as a follow-up to Mr. Chambers' question and what Dr. Lang had said, you know, we brought a lot of these programs back in district to save out of district costs, but that also comes at a cost in terms of hiring staff. And the number of staff that you have is dictated by the law. So I don't know, I'm just saying that I think that there's a lot of unknowns, and I think that we need to really kind of drill down on what those unknowns are and what we're going to do about them.
Can I just add something to Donna's, what Donna said? Because I do want to follow up on the head count, what we saw and what Eric said. You know, there is a lot of head count increases. But, you know, Jay did that, and the school committee did that for a reason. And that was to bring in these support for our special needs kids in the house. And I can give you a real life example. My girlfriend has a son who the town of Needham will now pay. He's autistic, and he's high functioning autistic, but they're placing him out of district. And that's going to run the town of Needham from one child $100,000. So yes, the school committee headcount has gone up. However, you know, if you remember a couple of years ago when these were coming in, Jay was telling us, you know, these were lower end salaries. So, you know, we decided, and I think, you know, the school committee decided, and I certainly agreed to it, you know, as a finance committee member, that made sense because it does, you know, it paid long term. Sure, there's always, you know, a head count here or a head count there that you can argue about. I think you have that across the board. You have that across any organization. But, you know, when we look at just pure head count numbers, you've got to be careful of what you're really looking at. And, you know, I always, when we see per student ratios, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, but that's divided by all and not just pure teachers, correct?
Correct.
So when we see the teacher ratio, so, you know, those are the types of things you got to be careful about the numbers because you could, quite frankly, you know, you can tell whatever story you want when you start doing ratios and stuff like that. But you know, 1.3 on the school side is a lot of huge difference. But I think we need to kind of go back and see what we can do. And I like to see, because I really do believe that coming out of this, we're going to have a huge requirement on the school side for additional help. There's going to be more requests for IEPs, which is going to cost more money. And I think we need to be prepared for that as a town. And it's, you know, going to be like that for the next couple of years. I would not be surprised. I think it's irresponsible not taxing to the full levy. And I think we need to revise Paul's goals. And we need to, you know, go back and see what we can do. See what little bit, like, you know, we can cut, even if we can get there halfway this year or a third, and just kind of figure out what's next.
Can I say something after Anita finishes?
Sure, Maria.
Is it okay?
I'm done. Go.
So, well, Anita just said something very important that I'm hearing a lot, which is coming out of COVID, more and more parents have had time to observe what's happening with their children in the home environment while they're trying to school them in the home environment because they become co-teachers in many ways. And what they're seeing is more and more a need to request evaluations. And so we're going to see a very large impact. And I think that it's very important what we did in keeping the numbers where they are in terms of staffing and increasing what we had to do at the middle school level. We just saw the performance at the middle school level. So in other words, yes, I think it's very important coming out of COVID that we're going to have a tremendous impact on not only the average student who coming out of this is got post-traumatic stress disorder coming on big, but also for students who need help. And having done what we did last year was extremely important. And no, we weren't thinking that 1.3 million was not going to be available. So I'm just going to say it that way. Thank you.
All right. So with all this discussion tonight, I guess you're looking for a vote from the board.
Yeah, but before, I can just make one more appeal one last time, and I know I'm beating this home. We shouldn't let the state off the hook. Damn it, we're sitting here talking about 1.3 million and $2 million budget increases. At the same time, we're maybe just accepting, at best, $150,000 more from the state. At some point, we got to deliver the message to our reps and to the State House that this isn't cutting it. And I don't know what the answer is, because I know, again, there's no picnic working at the state level either. But darn it, remember, they leveled all at us.
We need new revenue.
And
we need a governor who has some vision and understanding of basic math is what we need. And we need to push back hard.
Emily, what have you done? I mean, tomorrow I'm meeting with our state rep. I'm meeting our new state rep from Precinct 4, who's Rep. Howard. Are any of you coming to it?
Am I showing up in person on a day I have to work? No, I am not, Anita.
And I work more than you, trust me. So do not go down there. Don't even try to go down there.
You know what, Anita? Enough.
But I'm finding
absolutely enough. Stop it. You interrupted me, and now you are insulting me. You want to know what I do? You can take this offline. You call me, and I will tell you what I do.
I gotta shut. We gotta.
Enough.
Emily, I'm gonna.
Fucking cunt.
Oh. All right. With that, can we?
I do want to tell the Board of Selectmen that we are having a meeting tomorrow. Someone did send it out. And I would make a recommendation that you guys plan on meeting our new rep. I think it's important, and I certainly will plan on bringing this up, Paul, because I think you're absolutely right. And we need to ask what they're doing to help these towns, because it's not just our town that's going to have these issues with the students. And even on the Board of Health side, right? Like, they've been working around the clock this past year. They need help. So I don't want to just focus on the school, because I understand this is the 1.3, but I do know that even on the town side, we're understaffed as well. But there is a meeting tomorrow.
Anita,
I've gotten the Zoom invite.
You're getting some requests in the chat. If you could tell people about where and when the meeting is.
I think she's referring to as being sponsored by the League of Women Voters. The evening meeting? Yeah.
Yes, I got an email from, yeah, you're right, it was the League of Women Voters who sent it and asked if we wanted to meet our rep.
But I think the point is not about, I think it would be great to have as many people there as possible. I think Paul's point is not about one meeting, and it's probably a future discussion about how do we put more pressure through all of our state representatives and our senator.
That'd be a great goal for the Board of Selectmen, I think.
No.
I'm sorry, Ken, you asked the point. I think we need a target. I mean, if you go back to the slide 103 about the board's budget goal, it's working with the tri-board to establish a revenue target. I just need to know what the target is so that when I sit with Jay and with others, we know what we're striving for. It can either be a number, or, I mean, there's two ways you can do it. You can either give a number of 144 million, or you can say assume full levy limit. I don't know, but there has to be some target to go to, because otherwise we'll be all over the place.
Well, since
So
there's
Paul, why don't we,
between you and Jay, could I just ask, are the two of you comfortable with the way Paul's phrased it? I mean, you want some way to allow you guys to work it in the next 2 weeks, because there's a significant disconnect.
No, but we can work out how we get to that number, but I need to know what the bottom line is in terms of what's the total amount of budget. Jay and I can figure out how to work between his 1.3 and whatever I got. But what's the sum total that we're getting at? Is it full levy limit? Is it a number below that? What number should we be targeting at that we can then work off of to figure out how to get to?
well, let's do this, Paul. So when we were talking
Full
about
levy.
Paul, we had come in under the, you had released a budget and said we came in under the levy limit from the prior year, and that's, I think, where that goal stemmed from. Let's do it again. So why don't we just, we've never had this discussion in the past, so why don't you just do what you do, and unless the board disagrees with me, and you can handle it however you want, and then present back to the board what you need to do.
I
mean, I will agree. If the board is okay with it, we'll just remove the goal of coming in under the levy limit.
I think that, Paul's caveat to look at the balanced options of what to do with free cash in 2021 is reasonable in the fall.
I think that, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think that we need to recognize this as a starting point, not
Yes.
the end point. If we need to start someplace, then, this is where we start. But I think that we have to recognize that there's a lot of unknown information that we really need to find out before that final decision is made. And I think that we have to accept that there's going to be, changes, in order to be able to accommodate all of that unknown information.
So is someone from the board comfortable making a motion to allow Paul to go to the full levy limit?
I make a motion to allow Paul to go to the full levy limit because that's what we need to do.
Paul, do you need the target number of the 144?
No, just the guideline, because as I said,
2.5%.
there could be federal money and other things that could vary, whatever. But if you just say operate within the levy limit, full levy limit, that's fine.
I'll second it.
2.5%, which is inadequate and designs to be inadequate and has always been a failure proposition. Like, it's cute to try and go below, but that's only to free up OPEB funding that past generations failed to fund.
So actually,
This is not discussed at any meeting I was at.
We're just trying to pass the motion, and I will point out that you were part of that discussion. If you'd like the minutes, I'd send them to you. So I'll
I would love them.
Emily's motion.
Because it's a cute idea, but it's not actually practical, and it's not an actionable goal.
Listen, it's 9:30 at night, Emily. We've been going, the Board of Selectmen has been at this since 5 o'clock. We can argue over who paid attention in what meeting and what was said.
No, I'll let all the people.
Listen, I got to mute. We got to move on here. We have a motion on the floor. Tim?
Just to be clear, the full levy limit's not 2.5, it's actually more than that, because we did not go the full levy limit the year before. So I want that to be very clear. We're going to the full.
That's why the wording is
capacity
the
of
full levy limit.
Thank you.
That's why we're going to full levy limit.
Thank you.
We're going, I'm sorry, could you explain that? We're going to the 2.5% or to the full levy limit?
Full levy limit.
Virginia, they're asking for the full levy limit.
Okay.
Which is, so the lack of increase.
Which is what's included in the 144.
Correct.
Right, but you got to remember, so last year, to the average taxpayer, the increase wasn't as large. We're going to give them the increase they should have gotten this year and next year.
So I'm going to amend, Emily said 2.5%. I will amend the motion to allow Paul to work to the full levy limit.
I'll second that.
We have a second?
I'll
So a
second
motion
it.
is second. All in favor by roll call. Pat,
Aye.
Emily,
Aye.
Virginia,
Aye. Do we need the other board committees to vote too?
nope, it's just us. And I vote aye. So that's, you got 4-0. And just the reason why is because Paul has a goal. Normally we don't have this vote every year. Paul had a goal on his list of goals, and what he's asking us to override his goal. So that's why we're voting, so that he has that on record as an override of his goal. And just so everybody understands, George's not with us tonight. For those of you who aren't aware, he had a fall Christmas Eve. And he said I could share with the details, but he had a fracture in his neck. He should be back at our next meeting. He was one tough bird, I'll tell you that. But he did want me to tell everybody he's hello, and he's, you know, getting through it, and he's hoping to be back in the next meeting. All right, Paul, does that take care of your?
Yes, thank you.
And thank you, Paul and Jay and Denise, for all your work on this.
No, you're welcome. And, you know, I obviously, Paul and I still work very closely on this stuff, and we'll continue our talks. I don't want anyone to take away that, you know, we're not trying to work this through. I think it's just, you know, obviously a different dynamic and a lot of constraints on all of us, but we'll continue to try to plug this along. And I know Paul's time town meeting. So my budget presentation of the school committee is the week after. So they're coming right up on each other, but we'll work this through like we have in the past.
Okay. Is there any other? There's no other items on the agenda, right?
To
Okay.
adjourn.
We have a motion to adjourn. Do we have a second?
A second.
Second.
Do we have to get all the boards to vote or just the board of selectmen on
Raise
this?
our hands.
All in favor? All right. Thanks, Paul. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye.